Chapter 539, Late Night Operations. When an outsider picks up that holy sword, God will walk the land again. But what happens if the holy sword shatters? These two sentences echoed in the minds of Kalat and Edmonton. The matter was completely in the gaps of their knowledge. For a few seconds, they stared at the shattered holy sword, their expressions dull while they remained speechless. They couldn't believe that the holy sword, which had only been touched by an outsider in the evening, had suddenly shattered. What does this mean? What does it represent? The two of them didn't dare to think too deeply about it. They felt as if they had returned to the very beginning. Back then, one of the secret bases of the resistance had been discovered by the lone military. They were raided without any warning, and this resulted in their fathers being killed in that massacre. Their female relatives were abducted and sold to different places. Before receiving the grievous news, the feelings Kalat and Edmonton felt that day mirrored what they felt today. They felt heavy, confused, expectant, and unease, all of them mixing to form an intense pressure. Return to the forest, find the high priest, and figure out the reason. Perhaps this is the latest revelation from God. Kalat turned his wheelchair and said in a deep voice. Edmonton immediately stood up, saying to his remaining subordinates, "Continue searching for those blasphemers, but do not stay here. Also, instruct the believers outside not to hold any rituals or even pray." The unexpected change in events made him extra vigilant. By him, in the corner of the street where the Cathedral of Waves was located, holding a stack of white folded paper, Danitz turned his head to the side, feeling a mix of nervousness, worry, and puzzlement. "You mean that I'm to post them in different parts of the street and finally post it on the main door of the Cathedral of Waves?" He was very afraid that the door of the cathedral would suddenly open and a group of fist-brandishing priests and bishops would rush out, immediately attacking them without even asking why he had posted the poster. Klein maintained his coldness and said, "Yes." His original plan was to hand the matter of Sea God Calvetua over to Mr. Hanged Man, so that he could warn the Church of Storms. However, considering that he still held the secret of Bansi Harbor, and he might even have reported the matter, it would be easy for him to arouse suspicion with another piece of important information in such a short period of time. As for the solution, it was very simple. He could post a few posters on the mandated Punisher's front door so that they could see it as soon as they came out. There was a small problem with Klein's plan. He couldn't tell which of the shops around the Cathedral of Waves was the cover identity of the mandated Punishers. All he could do was make Danitz work a little harder and stick the posters everywhere in prominent spots, including, but not limited to, the front door of the Cathedral of Waves. "I should have run away earlier. Why would I think that this fellow had saved my life? Perhaps I would have been converted into gold pounds if he were any other powerful adventurer. No, who would have imagined that this lunatic would so easily resolve the sea god's curse? Fleeing might put me in an even worse state." While lamenting inwardly, Danitz unrolled the pile of white paper and casually glanced at the content. After Letitia Dolera and company entered and left the sea god's ruin in Simeem Island, they were pursued by the resistance. Meanwhile, Kalat and the resistance were trying to sell a strange bone sword that looked a little bent. Sea god Calvetua's body is on the brink of collapse with an extremely deranged mental state. Danitz froze for 2 seconds, then he subconsciously glanced at Gehrman Sparrow. "I can understand the first few statements, but why is there a mention of sea god Calvetua being on the brink of collapse and in an extremely deranged mental state? How does Gehrman Sparrow know? Did he discover a problem when he was dealing with the sea god's curse? And how did he deal with the sea god's curse? The organization behind him is more powerful than I thought. Could it be that it's similar to the Aurora Order, in which they serve a real deity?" The more he thought about it, the more Danitz trembled in fear. The first time he heard of the Aurora Order had originated from a robbery at sea. Back then, it was the first time he saw his captain's serious expression. After that, he was taught some so-called general knowledge of the mysterious world. Klein responded to Danitz with an emotionless gaze. In the poster, he had eliminated any subjective assumptions, and he had only described the matters that could be confirmed with certainty, so as to not interfere with the judgment of the higher-ups in the Church of Storms. Among them, The content regarding an important item that Letitia and company had taken away was excluded. The Lost Temple was changed to a broader and more inclusive sea god ruin. The base was obviously abandoned by Kalat and the others after realizing that something had happened to the sea god, so it was also left unmentioned. Danitz suddenly retracted his gaze, afraid to look any further. Captain said that the more secrets someone has, the more dangerous they are. He thought for a while and worriedly said, "If we stick it on the front door of the cathedral, it will definitely garner immense attention from the Church of Storms. Will they discover that I was the one who did it?" Klein gave a terse answer. "Yes." Danitz forced a smile and said, "Then wouldn't I be in grave danger?" Klein used his clown ability to control his expression and calmly replied, "You are already a pirate who has a bounty for your head. Do you think you can swagger down the main streets of Byam now?" Klein lampooned inwardly. "That's true. No matter what, they will still capture me and claim my bounty." "No, there's something wrong with that," Danitz blurted out, "but my bounty will increase." Klein looked at him, but he didn't say anything. All he did was grin a little. For a moment, Danitz thought he heard a rhetorical question. "Isn't this a good thing? A good thing for a donkey to kick." With a dry chuckle, Danitz took the pile of posters and, taking advantage of the heavy winds and late night, posted them in prominent spot on the street near the Cathedral of Waves. "It really looks like posting a small advertisement." Klein, who had one hand in his pocket, observed from afar and commented inwardly. He sighed and thought, "It's good to have an assistant. At least, I don't have to do something that tarnishes my reputation." If I were in Tingen or Backlund, if something like that had happened, the scene was too beautiful to imagine. Danitz finally reached outside the Cathedral of Waves, plastered the poster on the front door, clenched his fist, and pounded on the door. After finishing all of this, he turned around and ran, as if there were 10 mandated punishers running after him from behind. Klein didn't dare to be negligent. He pulled out a paper figurine, shook it off, and burned it to ashes before briskly walking to another street. After his recent encounters with the mandated punishers, he had a deep understanding of their style, and he didn't dare to be the slightest bit careless. It was only when they were far away from the Cathedral of Waves that they slowed down and regained their normal walking speed. Danitz had a good constitution. His face wasn't flushed nor was he panting. He was slightly puzzled and asked, "Why didn't you just write to the police or throw it in the Governor General's office?" Before Klein could reply, he had already realized why. That's right. The lower-ranking police and the staff of the Governor General's office are locals. They might very well pity the resistance or might be clandestine believers of Sea God. As they were talking, they turned a corner and saw an extremely large red building in front of them. The inside was brightly lit and music could be heard from within. People and carriages streamed in and out the door. It didn't exude any vibes that it was late at night. We actually ended up walking here." After a second of hesitation, a smile appeared on Danitz's face, a smile that all men understood. Red Theater? Klein, who was rich in theoretical knowledge, suddenly came to a realization. Danitz laughed mischievously. "This is one of the most famous places in the entire Sonia Sea. There are mysterious and flirtatious Balam girls, passionate Fainapotter girls, open and alluring Intis maidens, tall and graceful Faisak ladies, conservative and quiet lone women, gentle and docile natives. This fellow knows a lot. He comes often." Klein swept a glance at Blazing and said nothing. For some reason, Danitz felt as though he had been seen through, and he immediately laughed awkwardly. "This is what pirates talk about when bragging. I've only been here a few times. I didn't have much money in the past. I could only find some average ones, and it's mainly in the area of the Fog Sea. Afterward, I joined the Golden Dream. No wonder. Although Vice Admiral Iceberg's men receive quite good employment perks and often get to share in the treasure, it's still quite difficult to save up a few houses in Byam. Compared to the typical pirate, this guy at least knows temperance and saves his money." Klein thought in enlightenment. Danitz didn't wish to continue on the topic as he changed the topic. "There are a lot of street girls in Byam, especially there." He pointed into the distance and said, "There was once a pirate who did an experiment. He randomly knocked on a family's door, produced some money, and requested to do it with the mistress once. In the end, 3 to 4 families out of the 10 agreed. Teske, if it's someone like you, who has the standard lone look, almost no one will refuse you. They might secretly hide their daughters to prevent you from discovering her. Hehe, Lone's navy would commit many murders and rapes here every year. They aren't any better than the pirates, but they would only be sent back to the country and pay some small fines. Klein listened quietly, and he suddenly thought back to the evening when the believers of the sea god were praying around the pool. He thought back to their feverish and numb faces. Backlund, within the Odora family's villa. Emlyn White, who had taken the initiative to expose certain problems about himself, nervously followed Cosme underground. He once again arrived in the grey stone hall where the black iron coffin was kept. "Esteemed Lord Nibs, why have you summoned me?" Although Emlyn had rehearsed this scene in his mind dozens of times, he still couldn't completely remove the tension and apprehension in his heart. In this state, he suddenly understood a problem. From the viewpoint of theater studies, the role he was acting as should hide his worries and fears. There's no need for any special concealment. I did well. Emlyn was suddenly much calmer. A deep, aged voice sounded from the coffin that was covered with symbols and magic labels. "To reward you. For the ancestor, you risked your life to pray to the fool. Although you didn't receive a response, you bore an enormous risk. This is an act that needs to be rewarded. Here is an acceptance draft for £7,000, a reward for you. I didn't give it to you in a timely fashion due to the great smog of Backlund, but it's never too late. At the same time, you must always be aware of yourself and not relax. If anything abnormal happens, immediately inform Cosme." He really gave me money. Emlyn almost forgot to close his mouth. Chapter 540. Suppression. Even when Emlyn White left the Odora family's underground region, he still found things surreal. He couldn't believe that he could so easily be rewarded with £7,000. The acceptance draft was light and weightless in his hand, but he felt the absurdity of reality. The hangman's method was really effective. Instead of exposing me and punishing me, Lord Nibs gave me a generous reward. And this was done solely to feign ignorance while encouraging me to make attempts so that he can observe in secret. Are the thoughts of the sanguine that complicated as well? Emlyn sighed, his mind feeling adrift. Quickly, he stopped his thoughts from wandering and turned his attention back to the reward of £7,000. With this, I can buy that baron's remains from the hanged man and concoct it into a potion. I'll soon become a baron, sanguine baron, Lord Emlyn White. Emlyn's eyes lit up as his footsteps turned significantly brisk. Within the sanguine, if one wasn't bestowed the corresponding ritual by the elders, they would remain stuck at the same level they were at during birth. It was almost impossible to rely on time to advance. Unless one was extremely lucky, having an ancestor of the family that was nearing the end of their lifespan such that they had no choice but to bestow their powers to a descendant through a ritual, most of Emlyn's sanguine peers would remain stuck in the concept of adulthood. There might not be any chance of them obtaining an aristocratic title for decades. Emlyn's father and mother had lived for years, but they had yet to become barons up this very day. They couldn't even see any hope of becoming one. As Emlyn walked out the door, he couldn't help but glance at the nearby Cosme Odora. This elderly sanguine who has been active in the Roselle era has only been a baron up to this day. And I'm about to reach this rank as well. One day, I will become a sanguine marquis like Lord Nibs. No, a duke or even a prince. Only by doing so will I be able to shoulder the responsibility of being the sanguine's messiah. Yes, the baron's remains is only about £4,000. I'll have a lot of money left. I can even buy a few more dolls and give them some new clothes. Emlyn unconsciously straightened his back and began to walk more and more proudly. In the Berg household in the City of Silver, Derek lit some candles and prepared for the sacrificial ritual. The lightning frequency alternated several times before he finally found an opportunity. He was very sure that the chief wasn't be able to keep an eye on him at this moment, because he had left the City of Silver with the little boy, Jack, who had recovered somewhat, and a group of explorers, in search for the so-called route that led from the coast to the destroyed city. It didn't take long for Derek to set up everything and say Mr. Fool's honorific name in a reverent, low voice. He very skillfully and methodically sacrificed the spirit eater's stomach pouch needed by Miss Magician and the beyonder ingredients designated by Mr. Hanged Man to the ruler above the gray fog. There were many cracks on the City of Silver's solid city walls, but they were filled to the brim with black hard soil. Strands of dense weeds grew on them, swaying in the wind like human hair. All of a sudden, all of them stood up as if they wanted to capture something, but they turned limp without any strength left in them. Early morning at the Cathedral of Waves. Alger Wilson, who had come to collect the bounty, heard an important piece of news from the diocese bishop, Chogo. Letitia Dolera of the Moses Ascetic Order had disguised herself as an archaeologist and entered the depths of the jungle on Simeem Island. It was unknown what she did that inflicted grievous injuries to sea god Calvetua, who had been in hiding for years, pushing it to the verge of collapse. As a result, it was frantically searching for an opportunity to survive. Rumor has it that this evil spirit, which calls itself Sea God, had been discovered by two powerful cardinals of the military a long time ago. After it was defeated by them through the use of a sealed artifact, it could only barely escape and hide. This situation has persisted for more than 100 years. Without any intrinsic changes, why would it suddenly collapse and be unable to maintain its existence? Alger frowned slightly, wondering what the difference was. A situation deliberately created by the Moses Ascetic Order? But why didn't they do so in the past 100 years? To complement one of their other plans? Between speculation and doubt, Alger suddenly became aware of an important factor. The biggest and most fundamental difference between the last 100 years and now was that the world had come to buy him. Mr. Fool's Adorer had come to the Rorstad archipelago. Does his appearance anywhere indicate that something big is about to happen or is brewing? Previously, it was the Great Smog of Backlund, and there was the abnormality in Bansi Harbor. Now, there's the dying struggle of sea god Calvetua and the unknown plot of the Moses Ascetic Order. No, to be precise, wherever a major problem is brewing or about to happen, Mr. Fool's adorers will be there. They accept Mr. Fool's arrangements and pursue the activities of those secret organizations, the evil gods and angels. As soon as his train of thought changed, Alger was suddenly enlightened, feeling as though he had grasped the truth. It's not that things happen wherever the world is, but that the world and the other adorers will appear when something is about to happen. What good does this bring to Mr. Fool? Is it a plot solely to destroy the enemy's schemes, or does it help him lift his seal and release more power? Alger held back his doubts and decided to seize the opportunity to submit some intel from before. He clenched his right hand into a fist and pressed it against his left breast. He said with a look of hesitation, "Your Excellency, while pursuing the remnant forces of steel, I heard a piece of intel." "What is it?" Chogo had originally planned to send this bishop-ranked captain out into the sea to search for traces of the resistance, but he was forcibly interrupted by him. For a moment he felt irritated. Alger recalled and said, "Someone mentioned Bansi Harbor in a conversation. They mentioned that an abnormality had happened there, but the descendants of the Medici family were well hidden and didn't end up being discovered." Bansi Harbor, abnormality. Chogo took a step forward and pressed, "What else did they say?" "Other than mentioning that there was a fallen bishop of the church, nothing else." "Your Excellency, is the Medici family a dark family of the fourth epoch?" Alger asked deliberately. Chogo's expression sank. "That's not something you should know. I'll report it to His Eminence Kotman at once." Kotman was a Church of Storms cardinal, the Archbishop of Rorstad Sea, a high-ranking deacon of the mandated punishers, and the true ruler of the beyonder world in the archipelago, John Kotman. Chogo thought for a moment before asking, "Who was the person who mentioned this? What does he look like?" Alger was long prepared. "I don't know them, and they never showed up again. I remember that the person mentioning Bansi Harbor and the Medici family was an ordinary-looking, young man with a thin face, a broad forehead, black eyes, and black hair. He wore a monocle. He seemed to notice that I was eavesdropping, but he didn't show any anger. Instead, he smiled at me." Alger had been describing blasphemer Amon. He wanted the cardinals to believe that the exposure of the secret regarding the Medici family and Bansi Harbor was the result of a struggle between the kings of angels. This is really a suitable person to use as a reason. He wouldn't appear to defend himself, and even if he did, no one would believe it. And clearly, any divination regarding him would have zero results. If beyonder means are used to confirm my information source, there will be strong signs of interference from Mr. Fool, and they won't be able to get an accurate answer. From the looks of it, this is equivalent to what Amon did. Alger thought with considerable relief. Chogo nodded lightly. Find these people and trace the whereabouts of the resistance. Yes, Your Excellency. Alger answered with a look of piety and struck his right fist on his left breast. Dark clouds covered the sky as the rain fell down in torrents, creating white fog in the process. In the port of Byam, the blue water rose slowly but firmly, and the freighters and liners rocked like leaves fluttering in midair. The rain continued to fall, and the sea level gradually approached the dike. The city was flooded with water in many places, and the environment was greatly suppressed. One by one, the fanatical and numb locals, in their taraba shirts and tattered jackets, came to the edge of the cliff or the dike before jumping into the sea. Their flesh and skin rapidly lost moisture as they fell, and they were already desiccated corpses by the time they fell into the sea. A group of people were rioting as they hugged a Navy sailor who was walking out of a base. They angrily bit him to death with their teeth, reducing him to a mangled, bloody mess and caused chaos on the streets. Boom. The dike collapsed, and the rising seawater poured into Byam City. When Klein jolted awake, his mind was filled with the scene from his dream. For a seer, this was a very clear revelation. Sea god Calvetua has failed to find a way to survive and has completely given up, resulting in it going completely mad. It wanted to create a storm, stir up a tsunami, and drown the Rørsted archipelago so that countless can join it in death? At the same time, its devotees are starting to do extreme acts. I've already informed the Church of Storms. They'll likely be able to stop it? No, even if I didn't inform them. They'll definitely be able to sense a problem with the appearance of such a situation. They would then make the necessary response. Klein rolled to his feet, wore his clothes, and walked out of his bedroom. He saw blazing Danitz standing by the window looking out. He saw the clouds hanging low as rain poured down, as though it was endless. A sign has appeared? Klein walked over to Danitz, who was also looking out at the repressive weather. He could faintly hear the abnormal sound of the tide. In the midst of silence, the sound of explosive thunder suddenly rang out in the air. The leaden-colored clouds quickly split apart, and the falling rain lost its source. In the direction of the docks, everything returned to normal. The morning sun shone down from high up in the sky, bathing Byam in holy light. Danitz hissed and said to himself, John Cotman changed the weather. John Cotman? The Church of Storms cardinal and high-ranking deacon of the mandated punishers? He suppressed Calvetua's powers? Klein retracted his gaze while in thought. Danitz heaved a sigh of relief. I was rather worried just now. Afraid that the sea god who's on the brink of a breakdown would create a disaster. But there's John Cotman. Seeing that Gehrman Sparrow was silent, he continued adding, At sea, even the king of the 5 seas and Queen Mystic won't be his equal. Captain said he's a sequence 3 demigod. The potion's name is the Sea King. Chapter 541, Visitor Sea King. Upon hearing the name to John Cotman's sequence, the first thing Klein thought of was the complete honorific name of the Lord of Storms, the King of the Skies, the Emperor of the Seas, the Lord of Calamity, the God of Storms. Sequence 3 is Sea King. Sequence 0 contains the elements of Sea Emperor, so it does match well. I wonder what Sequence 0 of the storm pathway is called. Klein looked out the window again and saw that, although the weather was still gloomy, the morning sun was up. The sound of the tide had retreated, and the rain had stopped. He pulled back his thoughts and analyzed the situation from the information that Danitz had revealed. The potion name is Sea King, which means that the corresponding sequence 3 demigods, saints, have to act as a Sea King. And all acting has one premise, which is that one possesses all the powers needed. As a Sea King, he would definitely be a powerful ruler of the seas that he controls even if there's a distance limitation. He would be able to walk freely on the seabed, cause tsunamis as he wishes, raise the sea level and control marine life. Fighting in their home ground, they're absolutely capable of suppressing all demigods of the same level. The King of the Five Seas and Queen Mystic are roughly at this level as well. It's just that there are differences in strength because of the different degrees of digestion and their grasp on their powers. But no matter what, as long as they're at sea, Sea Kings are nearly unbeatable. With the abilities displayed by the Sea King, coupled with the oceanic environment, if one hasn't seen the eternal blazing sun, true creator, and other true gods, it's not incomprehensible that people would worship him, believe in him, and pray to him. Many of the deities who received primitive worship might be at this level. They might not even be angels. Yes, don't look directly at God refers to a true deity. Previously, sea god Calvetua didn't give me such a feeling, nor did Amon's avatar. Of course, I can't be sure if the actual body of a king of angels has some kind of attribute that also doesn't allow one to look directly at them. One is a sea god who's on the verge of collapse and at most, a sequence 3, while the other is a sea king who is in good condition and is able to use sealed artifacts at any time. The outcome is obvious. John Cotman would definitely be able to suppress Calvetua's madness to prevent the sea from drowning by him. He would prevent the entire Blue Mountain Island and its many cities from turning into a lost sea ruin. Just wait a few more days. Calvetua's madness will completely dissipate, which will end up resolving the matter. This is the simplest and most effective way to deal with the situation, and it wouldn't bring about any panic at all. Most people here wouldn't even detect anything amiss. However, there are also some problems. Firstly, there shouldn't be any other accidents. It's a mystery what that archaeologist, Letitia, did in Simeem Island. She had single-handedly orchestrated the death of the sea god. Perhaps the forces backing her, either the Moses ascetic order or the element dawn, might take the opportunity to seek something. This is the greatest dormant danger. Yes, there should also be a high-sequence beyonder in the Governor General's office and the military. This is a colony base the kingdom has in the Sonia Sea. Things won't turn out too bad. Then, there are the fanatical believers who will most likely become sacrifices as Calvetua becomes madder and closer to its death. They are like stalks during the harvest, falling down in bunches. However, for the Church of Storms, this isn't too bad of a development. The most pious of the heretics would die with their deity, which would save them the trouble of screening and handling them. If they aren't too pious, they wouldn't be affected too much, and it's possible to reform them. The only drawback is that the Rorstad archipelago would be lacking in manpower for a long period of time. Although such a problem is troublesome, as long as they grit their teeth, things can be resolved. Thus, the Church of Storms, Sea King John Cotman is more likely to sit back and do nothing. Phew, I wonder how many people will die in the native enclaves and slums because of this. Klein's thoughts were suddenly interrupted by a uniform set of footsteps and a roar high in the sky. Instinctively, he looked up and saw airships painted in dark blue, with several cannon muzzles and machine guns sticking out, fly past him as they headed in different directions. On the main street, soldiers in red coats, white pants, and black leather boots were lined up in neat rows. They were carrying rifles and dragging cannons as contingents of them moved past. The tense and solemn atmosphere suddenly spread. This is a colony. Klein inexplicably felt mixed feelings as he sighed to himself. I wonder how long it will take the church to get rid of that sea serpent and find the place where it's hidden. That place is definitely a treasure trove with countless precious items. Danitz, whose main job was a treasure hunter, suddenly spoke, appearing both expectant and full of regret. His attitude had changed extremely quickly. He had already reduced the sea god to a sea serpent, using it as a pronoun. The church won't do anything other than keeping the matter suppressed. They'll see Calvetua perish just from waiting for a few days. Of course, members of the Church of Storms might not have that kind of patience, especially when I've heard that John Cotman's main job is being a high-ranking deacon of the mandated punishers. It's just that with the archipelago isolated overseas, he also works part-time as a cardinal to unify his authority. Perhaps his style of doing things is more like that of a mandated punisher. The place where Calvetua is hiding? That ruin is almost integrated into the spirit world. Finding it wouldn't be so easy, otherwise, it wouldn't have led such an abject existence until today. At this thought, Klein suddenly had an idea. Finding the ruin where Calvetua is hiding would be very difficult to find from the real world. Since it has already perished, it's not something that can be found in a year or so, unless more accurate information is obtained. But if the search was done from the spirit world? The spirit world would make it even harder to pinpoint its location, but it doesn't completely lack options. Snake of Mercury Will had once done so with the help of his folded crane. I still have no idea how to do that exactly, but that's not important. I can ask Mr. Azik. Death's domain controls part of the authority of the spirit world. The underworld, or should I say, hell, was created by Phoenix ancestor Greg Race in the spirit world. A thought flashed through Klein's mind. He took out the ancient and exquisite copper whistle, put it to his mouth, and blew into it. He believed that even if he returned to the bedroom or entered the washroom, the messenger's massive body would be discovered by Danitz, who similarly had a non-trivial spiritual perception, so he didn't avoid him. Danitz was imagining the treasures of sea god Calvetua when he suddenly felt a chill at his neck. He felt something inwardly, and he quickly activated his spirit vision before looking to the side. There he saw white bones spewing out from the floor and flying upwards, forming a giant skeleton with an illusory head that pierced through the ceiling. The skeleton slightly lowered its head. Its two pitch-black flames at its eyes were visible even through the ceiling. The oppressive feeling brought by its massive body made Danitz jump to the side. His body was half-bent, and he conjured a scarlet flame in the palm of his right hand. What kind of monster is this? Danitz looked at Gehrman Sparrow in surprise, only to see him holding a copper whistle and lifting his head as he looked at the skeletal monster. Klein looked up at the huge messenger as the huge messenger looked down at him. Both parties seemed frozen in place. Tiske, I was too anxious. I summoned the messenger before I even wrote the letter. Should I make it stay here or let it return first and let it come back later? I'm Gehrman Sparrow now, yes, Gehrman Sparrow. Klein didn't say anything. He indifferently withdrew his gaze, took his time to find a pen and paper, and he began to write the letter. He gave a general description of the matter regarding sea god Calvetua, but he concealed the fact that he had nearly been possessed and how he had to borrow the gray fog to dissipate the curse. He mixed in information about Calvetua's ruins, where it hid, when describing the dream he just had. Perhaps, a solution can be produced using the spirit world, but I lack the corresponding knowledge and hope to receive your guidance. Klein folded the paper and turned to see that the messenger's hand had clenched at some point in time. He pretended not to notice anything and threw the letter up. The messenger paused for a second, then it opened its hand and caught the letter. Its body suddenly disintegrated, and its bones crumbled down, drilling into the floor. What was that? Danitz finally uttered a sound. Klein glanced at him and replied calmly, Messenger. Messenger? Danitz was stunned for a moment before understanding what he meant. Such a huge and terrifying monster is actually a messenger used for delivering letters? Indeed, there's a powerful secret organization behind Gehrman Sparrow. If I had such a messenger, everyone on the ship would envy me. It would be really, really cool. Danitz thought of how he would brag and flaunt his messenger when he returned to the ship. Putting away Azik's copper whistle, Klein got a chair and sat down, prepared to eat breakfast in a while. After a while, he heard knocking at the door. Danitz warily went over, and with the help of the peephole, he noticed that the person at the door was a middle-aged man with a boat-shaped hat. Elend? How did you find this place? Danitz asked as he opened the door. The visitor was the captain of the White Agate, just Elend. With wrinkles at the corner of his eyes, Elend looked into the room and chuckled. When you were checking into this hotel, you used Gehrman Sparrow's name for the registration. It's easy with a look. That's because this identity is quite proper and innocent. Besides, in the eyes of the Church of Storms, I belong to the military. Klein slowly stood up and said to Elend, What happened? Elend pointed outside and said, Byam met with an accident, but it's not a big problem. The military has joined forces with the church, and they're currently conducting a search and arrest operation throughout the city. They're searching for a few powerful beyonders who are archaeologists in name. In order to find the target as soon as possible, the military has used all their resources, but it's still not enough for such a large city. Heh, they believe that although you're of unknown origin, you're very friendly to us. They hope you can help with the search and prevent any accidents from happening. The corresponding remuneration will be available after the matter. This is all thanks to you for exaggerating my degree of friendliness. That is to say, after the Church of the Goddess and the Church of Steam and Machinery, I can once again receive money from the military? For a moment, Klein felt mixed feelings. Seeing that he didn't answer immediately, Eland added, although there won't be any major problems, the earlier we find the target, the earlier we can control the corresponding disaster. And perhaps that might save a few more people. Klein fell silent for a moment before gently nodding. Okay. Chapter 542. Byam under curfew. Seeing Gehrman Sparrow put on his coat and hat and pick up his cane, Danitz recalled that he had apparently been forgotten. He coughed once, and under the gaze of two pairs of eyes, he said, Do I need to follow? It's best not to. Who knows what would happen? Before this, we had only stopped at Banksea Harbor, but we ended up encountering a rather strange situation. Last night, I brought Gehrman Sparrow to visit the Resistance's liaison and ended up being involved with the Sea God's curse. Today, if I were to follow this madman to search for Letitia and the other archaeologists, then who knows what would happen? Danitz looked down and glanced down at his left arm, which was still tied with a splint. In a matter of days, he felt that he had encountered more events than he had in months or even half a year. You can stay here, but someone will be here for the sweep later. Eland laughed. Someone will sweep this area? And then the great pirate Blazing would be caught and turned into gold pounds? Danitz frowned and laughed dryly. Aside from the reward, there aren't many opportunities to earn money from the military. I'm very willing to give it a try. The only problem is that you'll have to wait a few minutes. I'll don a disguise, Mr. Captain. I don't want to put you on the spot by causing unnecessary misunderstandings. If I don't disguise myself, for a great pirate like myself to engage in operations with the military and the church, it will only result in me being captured immediately. Danitz imagined himself being pressed down, having a knee crushing his back, struggling like a catfish. After thinking for a few seconds, Eland took out an iron-black mask from his inside pocket and tossed it over. Just put it on. I will explain the rest. Yes, there's no need to waste time on useless disguises. Klein evaluated inwardly. Without a word, he turned the handle and walked out of the room. Eland followed close behind, and Danitz hurried to catch up with them as he grabbed his coat and put on the iron mask. When they reached the street where there was a lot of flooding but no pedestrians on the streets, Klein pressed down on his hat and asked, How do we start? Eland laughed. In regions. My Beyonder job has some special characteristics. As long as I see the person in the flesh, in a photo or a sketch, then I'll be able to firmly remember the target's appearance and obtain an additional sense on an extraordinary level. Yes, I can also detect any abnormalities and grasp indistinct traces. When put together, it allows me to do investigative sweeps in a rather effective manner. Sequence H. Sheriff of the Arbiter Pathway. Klein nodded thoughtfully and asked as they walked, Do you have their belongings? The poster Danitz had posted last night had a portrait of Letitia attached to it. Klein had used ritualistic magic to pray to himself and produce it. No. Eland shook his head. We have yet to learn of their previous whereabouts. The only things that we can confirm is that they didn't return from Simim Island until around 3 p.m. yesterday. And after 2 p.m., no passenger ships left the docks. And that due to the weather this morning, only entry is permitted. In other words, Letitia and company haven't left by boat yet. Klein understood what Eland meant. Danitz suddenly let out a sneer. That doesn't mean anything. Maybe they left Byam yesterday afternoon and went to the other cities on the island. Blue Mountain Island was the largest island in the Rørsted archipelago. It was very large in size and had dense forests and rich mineral resources. Therefore, there were many cities on the island, and they were all built around fertile land with astonishing mineral resource reserves. For this wealth, the Lone Kingdom first bribed the indigenous princes, then forced them to use force, and finally set up the Governor General's office. In a more efficient manner, it opened wide roads leading to cities and completed several important railways. This was in the form of establishing a corresponding railway company to sell shares and raise funds on the Backlund Stock Exchange. Of course, these large projects were accompanied by the deaths of many local people, sinister construction workplaces, excessive work, almost slave-like treatment, and a fairly modest salary, which allowed bodies to be buried one after another under the roadbed and railroad ties. To this day, a large number of locals still loathe the railway, believing that it had swallowed a large amount of human life and brought about countless suffering. It was the symbol of an evil god and devil. Alan turned his head to glance at Danitz and said, "If they leave by land, then there's nothing to worry about." "Why?" Danitz asked, puzzled. "It's very simple. The roads that lead through the forest are controlled by the resistance, and the majority of the resistance are believers of the sea god. Hence, how would Letitia and the others, who were responsible for Calvetua's breakdown, dare to pass through these regions at night? If they dared to, then it can only mean one thing. They didn't realize the severity of the consequences of what they had done in the sea god ruins on Simeem Island. This also negates the conjecture that either the Moses ascetic order or Element Dawn has other motives." Klein controlled the urge to shake his head, and he followed Eland into another street. Without explaining anything, Eland took out a notice and handed it to Gehrman Sparrow. "The main target is this woman." "I drew this woman." Klein glanced at it before tossing it to Danitz. At this moment, they heard the intense sound of fighting coming from the side room. "She has been found?" Danitz asked the question Klein wanted to ask. "Probably not." Eland shook his head. According to the orders, the first thing to do when discovering the target is to release red fireworks. Once it appears, everyone will close in on that location. If one encounters other wanted criminals who they cannot handle alone, they are to release orange fireworks. Surrounding teams would rush over to reinforce them. If they're ordinary pirates or criminals, we are to handle them ourselves. Let's wait. Perhaps it's because the fireworks couldn't be released in time. While he was talking, the glass on the third story of the house facing the street shattered with a crack. A bear-like brawny man jumped down. His speed was extremely fast as he ran into the distance like a cheetah. At this moment, an enormous shadow enveloped him, and Gatling sounds came from the sky above. The brawny man's body was almost torn apart by the machine gun fire as he fell to the ground without putting up any resistance. Blood flowed out and dyed the ground red. If the residents weren't forbidden to leave their homes, then they would have screamed. At some point in time, the airship had floated over, but it didn't stop and had turned toward another direction. "Goltet." Danitz recognized the victim. Seeing Gehrman Sparrow turn his head over, he forced a smile and said, "This is the leader of a pirate crew. He's from Fasak, with a bounty of 950 pounds. So they really are savages." He actually ran on a curfewed street, completely unaware to be on guard of attacks from above. That's right. Some pirates spent the entire night in a drunken stupor. They have no idea that even airships have been dispatched. If he had planned his escape route, then he might have been able to dodge the machine gun fire. Klein looked away and watched the monster in dark blue paint fly over the roof. When Danitz saw the pirate's outcome, he was grateful that he had followed Gehrman out. Seeing that the alert over here had been lifted, Eland didn't linger any longer and led Klein and Danitz to the area that he was in charge of. After walking quickly for 5 or 6 minutes, they saw a barricade at the intersection in front of them. Guns were mounted and cannons were set up. Lone soldiers in red uniforms stood guard over the area in silence. On the other side of the barricade, 20 to 30 corpses lay scattered on the ground, forming a vanguard formation. Their clothes were tattered and their faces gaunt, clearly indicating that they were natives. A little further away, several young native children were hiding in the corner. They were quietly looking at them in fear. Their eyes were dark and their faces were dirty. Klein and company fell silent for a few seconds before circling around the area. Backlund, Sherwood Borough. Furs lifted the ceramic cup from the table and felt the heat. She roused herself and quietly waited for any changes. The temperature of the hot water dropped rapidly, and a thin layer of ice appeared on the surface of the liquid. White frost appeared on the rim of the cup. "I'm a trick master now." Furs closed her eyes in delight. She didn't waste any time after receiving the Spirit Eater's stomach pouch, immediately concocting the potion and completing the advancement. She obtained quite a number of spells with lower potency. Among them, Furz's favorites were Fog, Wind, Flash, Freezing, Electric Shock, and Tumble, which made people slip. Only at this point did she feel that she was a complete beyonder. She was no longer someone who could only pass through walls or rely solely on ritualistic magic. At almost noon, Eland, with the help of Klein and Danitz, had completed most of the investigation. "Let's eat some bread and drink some water before continuing." He took off his boat-shaped hat and spoke with parched lips. Klein was about to nod when he saw an orange firework fly into the air not far away. Without hesitation, Eland put on his hat and ran in that direction. "I'll go and support them." Orange means other wanted criminals that cannot be dealt with. Who could it be? Danitz said to himself with interest. He switched to a gait of raising his legs high as he proceeded forward, hoping that the battle would be over before he arrived. Then he saw Gehrman Sparrow follow behind just Eland, leaving him alone by himself. Glancing at the dark blue monster, flying in his direction, Danitz let out a hollow laugh and quickened his pace. 2 minutes later, they arrived at their destination and saw a house with a lawn facing the street. 3 or 4 military personnel were lying on the ground. Their faces were pale, and their bodies were trembling as if they had been thrown into a frozen lake. The more Klein walked in that direction, the colder it felt. It was as if he had arrived in the polar regions. Soon, he discovered that the ditches outside the house were filled with thick snow. Just then, a burst of female laughter came from inside the house at varying pitches, alternating between craziness and strangeness. "Ha! Jaiha! Ha! Jaiha!" Danitz couldn't help but stop and touch his neck, which was covered in goosebumps, with his right hand. With a clanging sound, the window opened and a charred body flew out. It landed hard on the ground, as if it were caught in an inferno. With just a glance, Klein was able to recognize through his spiritual intuition that this was one of the 3 male adventurers who had followed Letitia. Chapter 543. The reality that exceeds expectations. The target appears to have been found. Klein looked away and made a rough judgment. As there were no portraits, the dead adventurer's face was burned black, which meant that Eland clearly didn't recognize this as one of their targets. After observing the situation and listening to the creepy laughter for a few seconds, he pointed to the 3 or 4 military personnel lying outside the house. "Drag them back first, then wait for the other teams to arrive before launching our attack." Or, he hesitated for a moment, then he raised his head to look at the approaching dark blue airship. Without another word, and without instructing Klein and Danitz, Eland ran to the unconscious military personnel whose faces were purple. The closer he got, the weaker his steps became. In the end, his body became stiff and every step he took became extremely difficult. Eland, who had been the bosun of the Imperial Navy, was experienced. He decisively stopped moving forward and turned around slowly, walking back 1 step at a time. The more he walked, the smoother it became. However, he was still shaking uncontrollably. His eyebrows and temples were covered in a thin layer of frost. A quick freezing effect that defies common sense. An extreme cold reminiscent of a disaster. With Eland's attempt, Klein was able to grasp the danger level of this area, and he could only sigh inwardly. Unfortunately, the sun brooch isn't able to produce actual heat. It's only a stimulation of one's mind. Although it can make a body generate clear effects, it will only allow a person to withstand this cold for 3 to 4 seconds at most. Looking at Eland's chattering teeth and how he was unable to open his mouth despite wanting to say something, Klein's gaze swept over Danitz. He threw his cane and said in a low voice, "Fire." Fire? Danitz was stunned at first, but he quickly understood Gehrman Sparrow. He had also witnessed the entire process of Eland's failure. A scarlet fireball that couldn't be considered bright formed on Danitz's right palm, and he threw it towards the flanks of the military personnel. The fireball traveled for nearly 20 meters and then landed on the ground without creating an explosive sound. Instead, it quietly rose into the air. The scarlet pillar of fire emitted sizzling sounds as it continuously shrank and quickly dimmed. Suddenly, it expanded, as if it was in a desperate struggle before it perished. Klein, wearing a black tweed coat, jumped out and landed right next to the military personnel. He bent down and reached out with both hands and grabbed the man's clothes. Then, he pushed his feet against the ground, exerted strength at his waist, and threw the man out. The military personnel immediately flew into the air, smoothly flying out before landing 10 meters away from the area, escaping the region with the coldest chill. After doing this, Klein snapped his fingers and lit a match in his pocket before the chill seeped into his body. The scarlet streams of flames gushed out like water, instantly enveloping him. By the time everything faded, Klein had disappeared from his location. Flames leaped out, flickering and extinguishing from time to time. With the help of Danit's fireballs and his own matches, Klein constantly phased around in the extremely cold area, easily throwing out several military personnel. After 2 to 3 attempts, he carried the last member of the military back to his original position. Eland had clearly recovered as he gave a thumbs up. "I'm very glad and honored to have made the decision to ask for your help today. Captain, I like your tactful praises. Also, remember to raise the remuneration." Klein nodded politely, half-turned, and looked at the open windows of the house. He heard the laughter grow stranger. Danitz pursed his lips to the side and silently cursed Eland. "Did you not see the contribution I made? Although my fireball has become something akin to a prop for a magic show, it still made actual contributions. This guy's nickname is just Eland, but he's not just at all." As he muttered, a shadow loomed over the area, and the airship had arrived in the air opposite them. "Evacuate the people in the surrounding houses," an officer shouted from the airship. After Eland and 2 other teams cleared several nearby buildings, the airship lowered its altitude and adjusted its cannon muzzles. Boom, boom, boom. The cannons fired continuously, bombarding the house, which was still filled with creepy laughter. Hearing the explosions and seeing the flashes of flames, Klein sighed as he held his cane. This is the firepower bombardment he advocated. He had once proposed it in Tingen City but was unable to put it into practice. And today, however, the overseas colonists were producing the real scene before him. Eland and the others stood guard in different positions under the deafening sound of the cannons, so as to prevent the people or perhaps monsters inside from breaking out. Soon the house collapsed, and smoke rose from the piles of masonry. All the snow and ice was gone. Suddenly, a thick bolt of lightning flashed, openly striking the airship. Klein frowned. He saw that the airship was completely still and heard a steam boiler produce a jarring sound. The dark blue monster in the sky lost some control. Significant amounts of smoke began to billow out as it began descending to the side. Seems like they're being shielded by ammunition and being protected by an outer layer of air. I thought it would cause an explosion, blasting the airship to pieces. Klein turned his full attention back to the collapsed house. When he initially felt the extreme coldness and saw the male adventurer's charred body, he thought he had met another demoness, one who grasped the witch potion formula. Having dealt with demonesses several times, he knew that beyonders of this pathway could control ice and black flames from Sequence 7. But that flash of lightning had made him reject this judgment. He believed that Letitia was indeed a member of the Moses Ascetic Order or Element Dawn, a real woman. The moment Klein arrived at this conclusion, the pile of bricks and wood were immediately lifted away. The bright red and charred figure crawled out, with its elbows used to prop it up from the ground. She was a female and Letitia's original appearance could barely be recognized. This made Eland and the others shocked to discover that they had already found their target. However, compared to before, Letitia's current state was both terrifying and miserable. Her body was covered in black spots. The artillery shells had torn open red holes that lined her body. White fascia that seemed to have a life of its own was squirming inside her body. The top of her head had split open, and her brain came oozing out, sticking to the surface like the palms of children overlapping each other. Her gray eyes were out of focus, one of them blazing with fire, the other flashing with lightning. 2 heads that were screaming in pain were embedded at her abdomen below her chest. They were the other two male adventurers. Not only has she lost control, but she also appears to be corrupted. She was already severely injured from the previous bombardment, and her aura had dropped to an extreme level. Klein didn't take action and instead watched as the Beyonders from the military began to attack. Psychic piercing, whip of pain, purifying bullets, and small-caliber gunfire were launched. With this series of attacks, Rampager Letitia, who only had enough time to crack the ground and spread the crack outwards, completely broke down and became a dismembered corpse. Her torso fell to the ground, and the heads of the two male adventurers rolled out. Klein's eyes slightly narrowed. He discovered that there was a yellowish-brown book hidden within the flesh and blood of Letitia's abdomen. On the surface of the book, there was a line of words written in Elven, Book of Calamity. Why do these books and notebooks always find themselves in the stomachs of people? It's the same as the Antigonus family's notebook last time. Klein lampooned. Then he suspected that the Book of Calamity was the item that the fake archaeologist, Letitia, had taken from the ruins of the sea god. At this moment, some military personnel grabbed the two male adventurers' heads who still seemed capable of speaking and hurriedly asked, "What did you do in the ruin of the sea god?" "Sea god's ruins," one of the male adventurers answered with pain and confusion. "We haven't been there." He tried to move his eyes, to check the situation below his neck. "The sea god ruin in Saimim Island," the military personnel reminded him. "No, we didn't." The male adventurer wanted to shake his head, but he couldn't do so. "We went to an ancient elven ruin. Letitia found a book there. She liked it very much. She quickly began to study it, then she went mad. She's crazy." As the male adventurer shouted out, whatever was left of his mind completely dissipated. "It's not a lost temple of the sea god but a ruin of the ancient elves? This is different from what I imagined." Klein was about to listen carefully when Eland came over and politely asked him and Danitz to distance themselves from the interrogation. Turning into another street, Klein slowed down and thought about the whole thing. Why would Letitia's act of taking the Book of Calamity out of the ancient elven ruins cause sea god Calvetua to be no longer capable of maintaining its existence, slowly bringing it to the point of breakdown? What's the connection between the two? According to Little Sun, the ancient god, elf king Saniathrim, wielded the present authorities of the Lord of Storms. That is to say, the elves no doubt possess Sequence 3 Sea King, or an even higher Sequence 2. Could it be that it was by chance that this sea serpent, Calvetua, discovered a ruin of the elves at the bottom of the sea, directly devoured the Beyonder characteristics left behind by a certain high elf, and was lucky enough to survive the two possibilities of death and losing control? As such, it succeeded in acquiring the rank of a demigod and gradually gained the faith of the Rorstad Archipelago's natives? Klein slowly came to a realization, and he had to thank Mr. Hanged Man for this. Initially, Little Sun didn't reveal the corresponding authorities of the 8 ancient gods, but later, under the guidance of the Hanged Man, he explained some things, including the Elf King Saniathrim general situation. As for devouring Beyonder characteristics or the corresponding ingredients to advance, it wasn't something that didn't happen. Before the potion system was fully constructed, the human ancestors had made similar attempts to obtain Beyonder powers. However, only a very small group of extremely fortunate people had managed to survive to become Beyonders without becoming monsters, lunatics, or dying on the spot, with their flesh and blood falling apart. Such an attempt had a 1 in 1,000 chance of success, or even a 1 in 10,000 chance. After the potion system was established, no one was willing to take such a great risk. If that's the case, then Calvetua was indeed very lucky back then. Of course, there's also the factor of its strong physique. However, its intelligence didn't seem to increase much, only being capable of deceiving its believers. It didn't actually find any traces of the elven ruins on Saimim Island, and how it's closely related to the one it's hiding in. After Letitia and company took the Book of Calamity, that ruin collapsed, causing Calvetua's hiding spot to experience abnormalities, resulting in the barely surviving Calvetua to be unable to hold out any longer? This can explain how Letitia and company managed to easily succeed. There aren't any members of the Resistance or the Sea God's followers defending the area. Only when something happened did Calvetua discover the problem and realize the connection between the two ruins. With what he just gathered, Klein tried to explain what he had been wondering about the whole time. This included why the dying sea god Calvetua didn't allow its followers to become carriers. It would have reduced most of the accidents and made things easier. With the brutality Calvetua displayed, it was only right that it made such a choice. The answer Klein arrived at was that the body Calvetua wanted to corrupt and possess had to have a certain amount of elven blood, and that was the only way to survive the transfer of Beyonder characteristics up to a certain level. However, when Klein touched it, due to the gray fog and his uniqueness, it allowed Calvetua to instantly find a better target. Chapter 544. Expert Klein had just sorted out his thoughts when Eland caught up with the two and said with a smile, "We've found the target. The investigation is over. I'll bring you back to the hotel first, and I'll bring the remuneration in 2 days. Also, it's best if you don't go out today." Klein maintained Gehrman Sparrow's character by only nodding slightly without giving any verbal response. On the way back to the Wind of Azure Inn, Danitz clearly had some doubts or wistful thoughts on his mind, but due to the presence of Eland, who was part of the military, he could only change the subject and discuss with great interest about which pirates would end up being caught in the city's thorough sweep today. To him, they weren't friends as long as those guys didn't belong to the Golden Dream. They weren't worth sympathizing with. After entering the hotel room and watching Eland leave, he closed the door and said while clicking his tongue, "The Book of Calamity. Ancient Elven Ruins. This really is an interesting matter, but how did the elves end up like devils? Just by casually taking their book? A casual flip through it had caused that woman to go insane and lose control. What kind of image do you have of elves? Living in the mountains and seas, specializing in cooking, creatures who enjoy nature? Heh, according to Little Sun, the 8 ancient gods before the cataclysm were all very tyrannical, very cruel, and very evil. Among them was the elf king Saniathrim, and the elves who believed in him and viewed him as their king couldn't have been any better. One can make a comparison with the members of the Aurora Order. The Beyonder races left behind by the Dark Epoch basically can't be associated with the good alignment that normal people have in mind. Klein replied in his mind. Of course, he didn't rule out the possibility that after the ancient gods' fall, the dragons, giants, elves, sanguine, and other living creatures would gradually extricate themselves from the negative effects and become more normal. However, this was only limited to the middle and lower levels, and it didn't include the demigod powerhouses. And the high elf that left behind the Book of Calamity was clearly the latter. With a thought, Klein suddenly realized something. Danitz understands Elvish. He recognized the title of the ancient goatskin book as the Book of Calamity. Vice Admiral Iceberg has actually taught her crew to such an extent. Not only does it include ancient Faesac, but she has also taught them Elvish, which can stir up the powers of nature. Perhaps Jotun and ancient Hermes are all part of the curriculum on the Golden Dream. They really are a bunch of pirates with knowledge and dreams. However, ma'am Captain, aren't you being a little overboard on certain subjects? Danitz is lacking in so many other aspects. That's right. The most important thing for a pirate whose main job is to be a treasure hunter has to be mastering the ancient languages. Klein ignored Danitz's comments and looked out the window. The sky remained gloomy, as if a heavy rain would fall at any time. It made one involuntarily feel suppressed. Klein nodded slightly, feeling slightly relaxed as he thought. Letitia has been found. Being aware of the ancient elven ruin on Simim Island, the Church of Storms and the kingdom's military will likely use its connection to the place where Calvetua is hiding to find the sea god that is becoming progressively crazier. Or they might use the ruin to speed up its collapse. That way, apart from the most fervent and pious sea god believers dying, the rest basically won't suffer any harm. Klein had originally thought of using the spirit world to locate sea god Calvetua's hiding spot after it died before the official Beyonders did. He could then infiltrate it, taking the treasure with him. But even before the plan had begun, the appearance of the Book of Calamity pushed his plan to the verge of failure. Phew. It's fine. It only existed in my imagination, and it never belonged to me. It's fine if I don't get it. I don't even know what I'll get. Letting this matter get resolved this way is for the best. Klein withdrew his gaze from the weather, his mood calm and relaxed. He just inevitably felt a slight sense of loss. That day, he and Danitz followed Elan's advice and didn't head out again. They only remained in the inn. In Biome City, there would be the sound of gunfire and explosions from time to time. This continued until the sky turned dark. The next morning, Klein got up on time and found that there were layers of clouds in the sky and the sky remained dark. This meant that the confrontation between the Church of Storm's cardinal, high-ranking deacon of the mandated punishers, John Cotman, and sea god Calvetua was still ongoing. Klein felt pain in his stomach and prepared to head to the washroom with the newspapers. However, he gave up on that idea when he saw Danitz leisurely reading a newspaper while lying in a reclining chair, munching on a piece of white bread in his mouth. Reading the newspaper while on a toilet doesn't match Gehrman Sparrow's persona. Although it would be boring, I mustn't slack off on acting. Sigh, I've once again found a difference in the behavior between my true self and my disguised identity. Klein summed it up in silence and went into the washroom. He took off his pants and sat down on the toilet, staring almost in a daze at the pale white wall in front of him, as if he could read words from it. At this moment, his spiritual perception was triggered. He hurriedly tapped his molars and activated his spirit vision. 2 thick, long white bones appeared in front of him. They were the messenger's legs. The messenger stood there, its head passing through the ceiling, but its black flames in its eye sockets could still be seen. It lowered its head slightly and looked down at Klein, who was sitting on the toilet. Klein looked up, stunned for 2 seconds, his mind filled with a baffling thought. Should I act like a woman, hurriedly covering my nether regions? Or should I just be open and fearless? Before he could make up his mind, the messenger dropped the letter, disintegrated into a pile of bones, and disappeared into the floor. It took a moment for Klein to react before he caught Mr. Azek's reply. This messenger is being more and more impolite. Can't you see that I'm using the toilet? Don't you know to knock on the door or to squeeze it through the crack under the door? Klein cursed in anger and amusement. After giving it some more thought, he felt that it would be putting the messenger in a tough spot to pass the letter through the crack in the door. The 4-meter-tall giant had to lie down in order to reach that position. Just thinking about it is rather funny. Well, the next time I write a letter, I'll add a paragraph so that Mr. Azek can educate the messenger so that he will be more polite. Klein unfurled the letter and read Azek's reply. According to the knowledge I've recalled, I can provide you with 2 methods. The first requires certain prerequisites. If a unique item belonging to you or someone else is located where sea god Calvetua is, you can use divination to easily locate its position. The other prerequisite is that you can enter the spirit world. I have plenty of methods for this. I'll list the most common 3. The second method is to use a secret deed ritual and pray to Red Light Ire Moria. He represents authority and will. At a certain level, he grasps the relevant knowledge of the creatures in the spirit world and the locations in the spirit world. So Red Light of the 7 pure lights is named Ire Moria. The principle of a secret deed ritual is to adjust one's state, release one's mind and body, and align oneself with the target of the prayer bit by bit. Finally, an overlapping will occur, allowing one to acquire the corresponding knowledge. And this kind of alignment and overlapping is relative. While acquiring knowledge, my secrets will also be open to the target of the prayer. I can't trust Red Light. I have too many secrets. Klein's first reaction was to rule out the second approach. As for the first solution, there was also the chance of failure. Klein didn't have any unique items located where sea god Calvetua hid itself. Either I use the help of the resistance and send something to Calvetua, or I'll have to find the original owner of an item sacrificed to sea god from its believer. Furthermore, it has to be unique. Send something to Calvetua? As he thought, Klein suddenly had an idea. He braced himself and considered it over and over again, thinking that there was a certain probability of success. After finishing his deed in the washroom, Klein washed his hands, took 4 steps counterclockwise, and went above the gray fog. He planned on attempting divination and received a revelation that there was danger, but it was manageable as long as it was handled properly. With all of this done, he returned to the living room and walked towards the reclining chair. Danitz immediately sat up and said with a dry laugh, "Is there something? Do you know the words to the prayer relating to the sea god?" Klein asked with an unperturbed tone. Danitz spread out his hands and suddenly hissed, "Dogs!" He softly cursed his injured arm and switched to smiling. "Yes. I've seen a few members of the resistance hold rituals. The details are, adorer of the sea and spirit world, guardian of the Rørsted archipelago, ruler of the undersea creatures, master of tsunamis and storms, the great Calvetua." By the way, the two instances that it was effective were recited in Elvish. Adorer of the sea and spirit world. Its bearing is very low. It's not the same as my honorific name. That's true. I created it by copying it from the 7 true gods. Klein nodded gently and said, "Do you know where there are empty warehouses and abandoned houses?" "Of course. Every great pirate knows a few," Danitz replied without hesitation. Klein turned around and walked towards the coat rack. "Take me there." "To do what?" Although Danitz was puzzled, he didn't dare ask. "In the dock area, in a dirty and dilapidated warehouse." Danitz watched Gehrman Sparrow take out 3 candles and several metal bottles. Unable to hold back his curiosity any longer, he asked, What are you planning on doing?" Klein didn't look back and replied very calmly, "Sacrifice." "To whom?" Danitz pressed with interest. Klein set up the altar, took out an iron cigar case and calmly said, "Calvetua." His plan was to give something directly to sea god Calvetua. As long as Calvetua accepted it, he could use divination and other methods to find its hiding place. As for whether or not Calvetua would accept it, he had certainly considered it, believing that it was a definite possibility. As Calvetua was currently on the verge of death, it was in a state of extreme madness, with little sense of reason. It acted on instinct alone, and it might have a strong desire for the aura of the gray fog. Therefore, Klein was prepared to sacrifice an iron cigar case that was often placed above the gray fog. He wanted to see if Calvetua would accept it or not, and if he didn't, he wouldn't suffer any losses. He could then pretend as though nothing had happened. Sacrifice to sea god Calvetua? At that moment, Danitz found his brain lacking. He couldn't comprehend what was on Gehrman Sparrow's mind. "Are you crazy? How could it accept your sacrifice? Even if it's accepted, what would be the point? It's dying, and it's very dangerous." Danitz blurted out. Immediately, he added inwardly, "No, Gehrman Sparrow isn't crazy, because he has always been crazy." Klein glanced at him and simply said, "In this domain, I'm an expert. When it comes to sacrificial rituals, I'm an expert." Klein wasn't modest about this. Chapter 545. The enraged Calvetua. Danitz felt choked, unable to say a word. He quickly stepped aside and watched as Gehrman Sparrow lit the candles, burned some powder, and dripped some extract. Taking in the smell that pervaded the air, he couldn't help but raise his voice. "Why, you're using the wrong materials, right?" He remembered that the resistance didn't use things like full moon essence oil, slumber flower, or chamomile when sacrificing to the sea god. "It's not like you're praying to the Evernight goddess." Klein turned his head to look at him, then he returned his gaze to the altar. "That wouldn't be an issue." As a professional who often offered and received sacrifices, he was very aware that the burning of extracts, essential oils, and herbal powder mainly had 2 uses. One was to help the ritual's host to better adjust his spirituality and enter the proper state, and the other was to please the corresponding deity, to please the target of the sacrificial object, and to increase the probability of a response. In this aspect, every deity had certain characteristics and preferences. This sacrifice, on the other hand, mainly relied on Calvetua's abnormal state of mind. It had gone completely crazy, and it thirsted for the gray fog's aura. Neither of the two could be missing, and everything else wasn't important. As long as the aforementioned 2 conditions were satisfied, pleasing Calvetua or not didn't affect the ritual. It neither increased the success rate nor would it increase the possibility of failure. It could be completely handled in a perfunctory manner. If Calvetua still retains its reason, and even if I were to strictly follow the requirements of its ritual, Do you think it would respond to me? Klein silently lampooned and took half a step back, ready to start the most important part of the ritual. He thought for a moment, then without turning his head, he said directly, "Stay further away." Instead of getting angry, Danitz was overjoyed. He quickly nodded. "All right, okay." He rushed to the door of the warehouse, planning to escape the moment something went wrong. Klein half closed his eyes, cogitating about the countless spherical lights that overlapped each other, and he quickly entered the proper state. He chanted softly in Elvish, "Adorer of the sea and spirit world, guardian of the Rörsted archipelago, ruler of the undersea creatures, master of tsunamis and storms, the great Calvetua. Your devoted servant prays for your attention. I pray for you to take this offering. I pray for you to open the gates to your kingdom." As he said the awkward sentences one after another, the sound of wind rose within the wall of spirituality, as if it was going to overturn everything. Klein's clothes fluttered in the wind as he took out another small metal bottle that he had prepared beforehand. He poured about 5 milliliters of the remaining thousand-faced hunter's blood into the air. This was a material filled with spirituality. The strong winds sucked the drops of blood, howling as it drilled into the candle flame that symbolized sea god Calvetua. Without a sound, the candle flame burgeoned to form an illusory door. On the surface, there were symbols and magic labels. From the inside, the faint sound of crashing sea waves could be heard. Suddenly, all signs of movement vanished. There was only the sound of breathing that reverberated through the illusory door, as though there was something hiding behind it, something massive that was suppressing its hunger with great difficulty. Huff, huff, puff. The sound of the loud, heavy breathing became clearer and clearer, to the point that even despite being situated at the door of the warehouse, Danitz still felt his scalp tingle. Bang! The illusory door suddenly opened, and something that visibly resembled a hurricane poured out. Amidst the sharp wailing sounds, Danitz felt the invisible wall of spirituality shatter. He discovered that he had been thrown into the air like a small boat in a storm. He slammed into the door, producing a dull thud. He fell outside the warehouse, his back scuffed from several wooden splinters. The scarlet fireball that he had instinctively condensed in his hand instantly dimmed and was quickly extinguished in the hurricane, like a candle that was about to burn out. While he was flying in midair, he saw what looked to be a bloody, gaping mouth appear behind the illusory door. It revealed milky white sharp teeth, which was slightly curved and longer than a human arm, as it madly smashed against the illusory door in a bid to enter the real world. Its beast-like howls first echoed inside the warehouse, causing Danitz to bleed from his ears and nose. Klein also flew up into the sky as a result of the hurricane, and his line of sight was immediately occupied by a bloody, forked and massive forked tongue that burst forth with sparking lightning. His body was scorched black as it stiffened in the air. The forked tongue pierced through his body as it was reduced to ashes. Klein's figure appeared on the other side. His hat had fallen off, and his clothes were messy. He looked rather wretched. Fortunately, he knew that a situation would occur, and he knew that there was going to be danger. He had constantly been on high alert, and he didn't let down his guard as he used paper figurine substitutes just in time. At this moment, Calvetua, who was situated behind the unperturbed, illusory door, finally realized that its violent blows had no effect and stopped. It took a deep breath and caused the blue seawater to gush in from all directions. The water then collapsed into a whirlpool that emitted a terrifying suction force. It was so powerful that it could swallow a cargo ship. The iron cigar case on the altar flew into the vortex. The tiny cauldron containing some herbal ashes flew up and into the whirlpool. Many objects within the warehouse, along with the soil, were thrown into the whirlpool. Klein also flew up as he found it difficult to resist being thrown into the whirlpool. He tried to snap his fingers to ignite flames and leap out of the whirlpool's reach, but the suction force and the hurricane spoiled his plans. His figure suddenly became thinner, turning into a paper figurine. As the paper figurine fell into the whirlpool, Klein, who had emerged from another position, once again soared into the air, unable to extricate himself from the terrifying suction force. At this critical moment, he no longer hesitated. He made the black glove he wore on his left palm turn pale as it was tinged with a slightly dark green color. He activated Creeping Hunger, and he directly used Steel Mavadi's soul. Klein's body suddenly grew heavy as he pushed forward with his left palm. An ice wall, that wasn't too thick, solidified in front of him, helping him temporarily isolate Sea God's whirlpool. Taking advantage of this, Klein landed, his feet heavily landing on the ground as he sank deep into the ground. Gotcha! The ice wall lasted only a second before it was shredded to pieces by the boundless suction force, and the remnants flew into the huge sea serpent's throat. Relying on the strength of a zombie, Klein used both of his feet to hold himself in place and no longer flew up again. However, he was still unable to stop himself from sliding towards the illusory door where Calvetua's gaping mouth was. He drew 2 deep ravines on the ground in the process. Outside the warehouse, Danitz wasn't affected by the suction force of the whirlpool. Instead, he tried condensing a fireball to throw to the side, allowing Gehrman Sparrow to jump out of his predicament and escape. Unfortunately, the flames were extinguished again and again by the hurricane. As Klein drew closer to the illusory door, he could smell the stench of blood and decay. Right in front of him were milky white fangs that emitted a chilly air. His thoughts raced, and he quickly came up with a solution. The solution was simple: it was to throw out the all-black eye that originated from Nimblewright Master Rosago. Since you want to make a whirlpool in the sea in a bid to devour everything, I will make you consume another bottle of a Beyonder potion without any supplementary ingredients, as well as the mental corruption of the true creator. If that's the case, I don't believe that you, who's already on the verge of collapse, will be able to hold on. Klein gritted his teeth and reached into his pocket. Perhaps it had sensed his malicious intent, or perhaps it had lost its patience, but at this moment, Calvetua suddenly raised its head and let out a long howl, causing the seawater whirlpool in his throat to collapse and disintegrate into countless water droplets which sprayed out of the illusory door. Splash! Torrential rain fell in the warehouse, and a dazzling silver ball of intertwined lightning condensed in Calvetua's throat once again. With a boom, it spat out that lightning ball. Amidst the torrential rain, the silver ball of lightning transformed into streaks of stunning lightning bolts that quickly expanded outwards. It destroyed the frugal altar and occupied the entire warehouse. Sizzle! Klein's figure kept phasing in and out of existence amidst the sea of lightning. His body would char and turn into scraps of paper. Outside the warehouse, Danitz also suffered its effects. All his hair stood up as his body convulsed. After continuously using paper figurine substitutes and approaching his limit, Klein finally managed to withstand it until the lightning subsided. As for the illusory door, it was affected by the complete destruction of the ritual and quickly closed. Sea God Calvetua's hisses of indignation were isolated by the door. After a moment, the illusory door completely disappeared. The surroundings were in a wretched mess. Only a candle was left on the altar, weakly swaying its flame. Bang! Danitz leaned forward against the warehouse's wall, barely standing at the doorway. He tried to speak, but he couldn't stop convulsing. He could only express his grievance with his eyes. Gehrman Sparrow is really a madman. I can still remember the horror I experienced in Banshee Harbor, and I still have nightmares about it. Previously, when he was picking out items offered by the Resistance, he attracted the curse of the sea god. I was so frightened that I almost ran away while on our journey back. This time, he even did some sacrificial ritual and nearly summoned Calvetua over. It was really extremely dangerous just now. Why does he love to take risks so much and enjoy causing major trouble? Time after time, he searches for thrills while on the brink of death. Is this a manifestation of his craziness, or is there another reason? Sea God Calvetua is still very strong. Even though it's on the brink of death, and there's the door of sacrifice in between us, it was still able to release a portion of its strength that could easily finish me off. As expected of a demigod that can fight against a sea king, Klein pulled his feet out of the ground and saw that his boots were in tatters. At the same time, he found that, regardless of it being due to luck or an inevitability, Calvetua had accepted his sacrifice in all sense of the word. This was because the huge sea serpent had swallowed the iron cigar case, which had been tainted with the gray fog's aura and many other things while producing the whirlpool. In other words, I can try to locate its hiding place in the spirit world, but I'll have to wait for its death so that it can't interfere and resist my divination. This search would require me to enter the spirit world, and I can't keep using the gray fog forever. Klein quietly let out a breath. He felt the glove on his left hand become filled with an indescribable madness and hunger. It seemed like it was going to devour the wearer if it wasn't fed. There are no sinners around. Klein turned his head to look at Danitz, who was standing by the door. Danitz's mind suddenly tightened. He felt as if he was being targeted by a monster and was about to become food for the other party. The hunger he felt at a spiritual level had made him tremble slightly. He yearned to immediately turn around and flee. Then he heard Gehrman Sparrow's indifferent voice. "Close the door from the outside." "All right." Resisting the residual pain from the electric shock, Danitz moved the door, which had been sent flying open, barely closing the hold. Klein seized the moment to carry out a sacrificial ritual. He prayed to himself and responded to himself by throwing creeping hunger that was about to lose control above the fog. The mystical item that had frightened Danitz, so much so that he didn't dare to resist, immediately became docile, gentle, and tame. Chapter 546, Spirit World. Upon returning to the real world, Klein extinguished the candles, put away the remaining items, and carefully checked the situation in the warehouse. Luckily for him, the whirlpool of seawater created by Calvetua had completely wiped the area clean, leaving only the subsequent sprays of rain, the blackened patches from the lightning strikes, and sparse piles of ash, as well as the ravines produced by Klein's 2 feet. The traces are easy to deal with. I can get Danitz to use his fireball to wash the place later, disguising it as an internal strife between pirates. Klein nodded indiscernibly and pulled out one of the few remaining paper figurines. He shook his forearm and flicked his wrist. The paper figurine flew out and burned on its own before turning into black ash. After doing all of this, Klein walked towards the door, frowning as he walked. The soles of his boots were gone, and the rest of his clothes were tattered and torn, wet or charred. This was unavoidable under those circumstances, as it wasn't something a paper figurine could withstand. The tearing was a result of the potent suction from the whirlpool, the moist sensation came from Calvetua's torrential rain, and the charred black marks were a result of being struck by bolts of lightning in the interval when Klein was using his paper figurine substitutes. Even now, despite having calmed down, his right forearm still spasmed a few times due to the electric shock. "It cost me £8.6 solely. I have to get a new set of clothes." I had divined danger and had made preparations, but I didn't expect Calvetua to be more powerful and crazier than I had expected. "I hope that I'll gain something later." Klein silently shook his head. He restrained his expression and endured the pain before coming to the door and knocking 3 times. Danitz, who was constantly uneasy, hesitated for 2 seconds before he opened the door. Discovering that Gehrman Sparrow had returned to his cold and reserved state, with him no longer emitting a hunger and madness that struck terror to his spirituality, Danitz let out a sigh of relief. He took a glance inside and asked, "Is it over?" "No." Klein curled the corners of his lips and revealed a gentle smile. "Not yet?" Danitz jumped in fright. What else needs to be done?" Klein maintained his smile that concealed madness. "A cleanup is still necessary. That's basic courtesy." "The cleanup?" Danitz was stunned. Raising his right hand, he pointed at himself and said, "Me?" The corners of Klein's mouth widened. "Or shall I do the honors?" "Then I would be eaten by creeping hunger." Danitz let out a hollow laugh. "How should I clean this place?" "Use a fireball," Klein answered simply. As a part-time pirate, it didn't take much effort for Danitz to understand Gehrman Sparrow's intentions. He walked past him and headed for the interior of the warehouse. During this process, he had a few questions in his mind, which were quite puzzling. Captain said that creeping hunger needs to devour a living person every day, but Gehrman Sparrow can only satisfy it after a battle. He usually doesn't bother with it. Besides, in that battle just now, Gehrman Sparrow had used Steel Mavadi's ice powers. He didn't feed it after? Strange. What secret lies behind this? A seal of a certain level? Or can it be that the organization behind him is capable of sealing creeping hunger? As Danitz cleaned the warehouse, Klein stood outside, looking up at the overhanging dark clouds, looking forward to what would happen next. I've already sent the iron cigar case that's tainted with the gray fog's aura over, so all I need to do is wait for Calvetua, a fake sea god, to collapse and die. I hope the Beyonders of the Church of Storms and the Kingdom's military won't have the time to find it in time, or leave behind some items of certain value that they think little of. Klein slowly took in a deep breath, listening to the dull bombardment sounds coming from behind him. In a hotel, Alger stood at the window, staring out at the overcast sky. I received the sanguine's anesthetic gas not long after the last tarot gathering. I was prepared to go out to sea to gather ingredients, but a week has passed, and I'm still stuck in Byam. The corners of his mouth twitched as he shook his head. First, there was the incident of the world hunting Steel Mavadi. It earned him quite a sizable amount of money, and then he had to wait for the reward. After that, when the reward was obtained, he encountered the breakdown of that sea serpent, Calvetua, and was ordered to search for the adventurers and archaeologists, Letitia and company. I heard that during the investigation yesterday morning, Letitia and the others were found. The mandated punishers and the military seem to have obtained some important clues, and quite a number of them went to Saimim Island. This is something that I'll never have dibs on. Alger retracted his gaze, pulled up his short robe that didn't reach his knees, and muttered to himself. Let it end as soon as possible. Once Calvetua was completely dead and the tsunami was no longer a latent risk, he could leave the harbor. After leaving the city of generosity, Byam, he could work at advancing to sequence 6 Windblessed. As his mind whirred, Alger's heart skipped a beat and he turned around to look out the window. He saw the clouds high in the sky quickly dissipate, with the crimson moon quietly hanging in the sky. Klein slept until midnight, when he was suddenly jolted awake. He had vaguely sensed something. He rolled out of bed, went to the window, and pulled back the curtains. Crimson moonlight shone in, covering everything like frost. It was cold and dreamy. Klein looked out and saw that the clouds which hung low had disappeared. The bright crimson moon was high in the sky amidst the sparse stars. This means that the confrontation between the sea god and sea king has ended? Klein pondered for 2 seconds, retracted his gaze, closed the curtain, took 4 steps counterclockwise, and went above the gray fog. He sat at the end of the long, mottled table, took out a gold coin, and began to recite a divination statement in a low voice. Calvetua is completely dead. After he repeated this 7 times, he flicked the gold coin and watched it leap upwards and tumble down. The gold coin landed in Klein's palm, and the king's head faced up. It meant a positive result. It meant that sea god Calvetua was completely dead. As expected, the ancient elven ruins on Saimim Island and the hiding place which Calvetua used to maintain its existence are closely connected. The mandated punishers and the military have just received the Book of Calamity, and since they only learned about the ruins for a little more than a day before, Calvetua couldn't hold out much longer. I thought it could forcibly survive for 2 or 3 more days. Klein sighed and tried to divine whether the official Beyonders had already entered Calvetua's hiding place. Unfortunately, due to the lack of information, his divination failed, and he was unable to obtain any revelations. After thinking for a while, Klein changed his angle, undid his spirit pendulum, and began to divine if it was dangerous for him to search and explore Calvetua's hiding place. As this involved himself, he quickly received a conclusion. The topaz pendant was rotating counterclockwise at a not-so-fast frequency and low amplitude. It's dangerous, but it's acceptable. The danger is even less than the sacrificial ritual. Klein nodded gently, returned to the real world, and began his preparations for his operation. He locked the bedroom door first, then he arranged the ritual to summon himself. Once again entering above the gray fog, Klein picked up the Dark Emperor card and placed it inside his spirit body. All of a sudden, he turned corporeal as if he was of flesh and blood. The surrounding black fog stuck to the surface of his body and formed a majestic aura. It was as if he was entirely clad in physical armor, but on his head was a gorgeous pitch-black crown. Looking at the human-skinned glove on the table, Klein hesitated to put it on. Above the gray fog, creeping hunger was almost in a sealed state. It didn't dare to make any unusual movements, but once it left the area, the uncontrollable hunger would cause harm to its wielder, whether they were alive or in spirit body form. Amidst Klein's considerations was whether the Dark Emperor's high level could suppress the creeping hunger inside his spirit body and keep it normal. I'll give it a try. If it doesn't work, I'll end the summon and return here. This will hardly require any time, and there's no danger. Klein picked up creeping hunger and put it on over the iron-black armor gauntlet. He didn't hesitate any longer and stepped into the door of summoning. With the help of the expanding candle flame, he arrived in the real world. Without being careless, Klein's first reaction was to check the state of creeping hunger. He found it calm and submissive, subservient to the high level of the Dark Emperor. Not bad. With a sigh of relief, Klein placed the mystical items, such as Azek's copper whistle, the biological poison bottle, and the sun brooch, into his body one by one. Finally, he picked up his black hardwood cane and prepared to use it to search for his lost, iron cigarette case that had been tainted with the gray fog's aura. Of course, in order to find the place where Calvetua was hiding, one had to first enter the spirit world and pinpoint the location from within. Otherwise, it would only fail. As for how to enter the spirit world, Klein didn't consider the three methods provided by Mr. Azek. As a spirit body with intelligence and the ability to think, how was he not able to find the spirit world and enter it? He calmed down a little and recalled the scene of countless spherical light. His body and mind quickly became tranquil. His thoughts gradually became empty as his consciousness gradually extended and expanded. He soon discovered that he was surrounded by indescribable, illusory, transparent things. All the colors became bright, distinct, but overlapping, and the gray fog had grown so faint that it seemed to cover everything in an ethereal manner. In the depths, high up in the sky, there were 7 rays of lustrous brilliances that shone with different colors. They seemed to possess life, and they contained immense knowledge. This was the spirit world. It completely overlapped with reality and was omnipresent. If I happen to encounter the mandated punishers or military personnel, I will immediately end the summoning and return above the gray fog. Klein took a step forward. After easily entering the spirit world, he felt his body become illusory. The black cloak behind him fluttered up slightly, and the hardwood cane in his hand stood upright. He said in a low, dignified voice, "The location of my unique iron cigar case." While chanting, Klein felt tense for a baffling reason. In the saturated and distinct colors of his surroundings, pairs of indifferent and eerie eyes glanced over. After repeating it 7 times, Klein released his grip and waited for the revelation. The black hardwood cane floating forward at an adequate speed which was neither too fast or slow. Klein followed it, flying through the real, the illusory, the strange, and mysterious spirit world. Here, if he lost his bearings, it was very easy to end up completely lost and never be able to leave again. Of course, there wasn't a problem for Klein. If he really got lost, he could end the summoning and return directly to the space above the gray fog. Klein chased after the black cane, which was sometimes thrown and sometimes dropped, shuttling back and forth between distinct and overlapping colors. He passed by half-hidden spirit world creatures that couldn't be accurately described, and it was hard to know how far he had traveled. Suddenly he saw an eye. It was round, with clear blacks and whites. The eye looked at him without blinking. There was no head, nor was there a corresponding body. Chapter 547. Priest. The huge eye, which had its blacks and whites clear, appeared translucent. It floated quietly behind saturated, overlapping colors. Klein couldn't tell if it was hostile or friendly. At this moment, Klein remembered a passage from the sites in the spirit world. The ancestor of the Abraham family had said, "Try not to cross eyes with any creatures of the spirit world for more than 3 seconds unless they have already expressed interest in communicating with you. This is considered provocative behavior. Also, do not let yourself appear terrified and nervous. For some predators, this will increase their desire to attack. As the words flowed through his mind, Klein retracted his gaze and continued to chase after the flying hardwood cane in front of him at a rather adequate speed. The sight of the full black armor set and black crown he donned, matched with a cloak of the same color, entered the round eye. But the figure quickly passed by, disappearing far away. It didn't stir up the slightest change. In essence, the spirit world is a very dangerous place. If one isn't careful, one can encounter a terrifying existence at the demigod level. As Klein continued to make his way through, he realized that this place was truly chaotic. Although the 7 lustrous brilliances that could be used to mark his location remained high above, covering the sky, they could still be seen from time to time beneath his feet, to his left and right, and from the front and back. If not for his black cane, Klein wouldn't have been able to determine his bearings. Suddenly, through the faint fog of the void, he saw, on his left, based on a normal human being's concept of left, a floating castle. It was entirely black in color. Its spire towered, and it was covered with vines, extremely reminiscent of a Gothic style. At the top of the castle stood a translucent woman who was almost as tall as the castle. She was wearing a complex, gorgeous, dark, and gloomy black dress. She didn't have a head, and there was a neat cut by her neck. Her drooping hands held 4 blonde heads with red eyes. If one looked closely, they would find that these brilliant-looking heads were exactly the same. When Klein, who was disguised as the Dark Emperor, passed by, the 4 heads the woman carried blinked. Klein didn't respond as he flew forward as though he hadn't seen her. The woman slowly turned her body, letting the heads in her hand watch him depart. What kind of monsters are these? As the thought flashed through Klein's mind, he saw the black cane plummet rapidly. He hurriedly chased after it, once again experiencing the feeling of a free fall. About 8 seconds later, a faintly discernible collapsed building appeared in front of him. Outside of the building floated a spirit world creature which resembled a giant jellyfish. It extended transparent, sticky tentacles and pulled the surrounding area into its own territory. At the end of each tentacle grew a white skull with deep eye sockets. It kept shaking as it floated about with light but slow movements. The black cane passed through the strange creature of the spirit world and hovered in front of the almost illusory collapsed building. Found it? Klein was delighted at first before he solemnly glanced at the giant jellyfish that was waving its skull. He made preparations for battle, but he didn't attack immediately. Instead, he tried to emit the profound dignity that came with the high level of the Dark Emperor card. His eyes indifferently stared at the eye sockets that were deeply recessed. After 3 seconds of frozen silence, Klein said Ancient Hermes in a low voice, "Leave." The tentacles supporting the skulls twitched twice. Then, the giant jellyfish slowly floated up, disappearing into the depths of the spirit world. This Dark Emperor card is still very useful. I was already considering throwing Mr. Azek's copper whistle. The descendants of death should still have some standing in the spirit world. Klein breathed a sigh of relief and descended, grabbing the black hardwood cane. Then he fell into the collapsed building ruin, with a sense of anticipation. For him, even if the Church of Storms and the kingdom's military had found this place ahead of him and had taken away the most valuable items, he would still be satisfied as long as there were still some remaining. Even if there's nothing else, it'll be sufficient for me to explore in elven ruins and see what information they left behind. When Klein passed through an ethereal barrier that resembled a curtain, he felt the air around him suddenly become thick and heavy. A shimmering wave of light appeared around him, coming from the deep blue water that filled the area. At the bottom of the sea was an ancient, dark ruin. All the buildings had either collapsed or half-collapsed. A huge pillar, carved with strange patterns and symbols, extended out from the middle. It appeared to be heading straight up to the top, as if it had supported the place in the past, but now it was broken and was leaning on the top of a nearby building. Klein recognized this place as well as the pillar. It was the hiding place of sea god Calvetua, a hidden place where reality blended with the spirit world. At this very moment, an unwilling, pained, angry, and crazed scream echoed in the air. It didn't weaken in the slightest. That scream was precisely the same howl of hatred that Calvetua had let out before its death. It's really dead. Holding the black cane, Klein landed on the greenish-gray stone road in front of the ancient ruins. On both sides of the road stood pillars that were neither thick nor tall, and on them were also strange patterns that were different from the symbols and magic labels from before. At the bottom of each stone pillar, there was a figure sitting beside it. Some of them wore ancient robes, while some wore brown jackets that were fashionable nowadays. As soon as they sensed someone approaching, they raised their swords, axes, and other weapons, stiffly but quickly. They turned to where Klein was, revealing their weathered, grayish-black faces and their shriveled bodies which were devoid of any flesh or blood. Their eyes, feverish and numb, were fixed on Klein, who was wearing a black crown and black armor. Calvetua's devotees. However, this also means that the Church of Storms and the kingdom's military haven't found this place yet. Klein sighed and injected his spirituality into the sun brooch. He muttered a word in ancient Hermes, holy. He activated the sun brooch's holy oath, and through the corresponding word in ancient Hermes, he temporarily added a holy attribute to the damage he dealt with his attacks. Klein flicked his wrist and threw his cane. He bent his body slightly and charged towards the first sea god guard, who came rushing over. While running at high speed, Klein suddenly turned left and dodged the enemy's axe. He then swung his arm backwards and used his cane to draw a clear grayish-white crack on the enemy's body. Pure golden flames silently rose from within the crack, wrapping around the sea god guard and burning it until it was on the verge of collapse. Bam! Klein exerted strength into his feet and stomped past the enemy. Behind him, the completely desiccated sea god guard finally collapsed, turning into ashes within the golden flames. Klein bent his back, quickly moving forward, sometimes to the side, and sometimes diagonally as he passed by each of the sea god guards. At the same time, he brandished his cane, whipping, stabbing, cleaving and slashing, leaving different marks on the guards that resembled desiccated corpses. Klein passed through the road and arrived in front of the half-collapsed ruins. Behind his gently fluttering black cloak, the sea god guards bloomed into golden torches, lighting up the greenish-gray stone slate and the patterned pillars. Amidst the chaos, the guards fell down, one after the other, and no longer moved. Klein went up the steps and entered the building where the half-collapsed pillars were. The first thing that entered his vision was an unimaginably huge blue sea serpent. The scales all over its body were slippery, and they were covered with patterns that were similar to the symbols inside the ruins. Its gaping jaws bit into a pillar, its curved milky white fangs sinking in. Its body below its head height was slumped across the ground. Its coiled body occupied about a third of the expansive hall, like a small, blue hill. However, its surface was covered in wounds with mangled blood and flesh. Even its bones could be seen. A mysterious cyan light had already gathered over its body as it crept slowly towards one of its fangs that was longer than a human arm. This caused the slightly curved sharp bones to slowly straighten up. Its dying cry reverberated in the air, causing Klein's corporeal spirit body to show signs of instability. At this moment, an old man wearing a clergyman's cap was lying beside Calvetua's body. His hair was gray, and his body was like a gray rock. He stuck his face tightly to the serpent's body, making incomprehensible sounds from his throat. His actions were an unknown. Around the gigantic serpent's corpse were desiccated corpses. They were similar to the sea god guards outside, but they were even more bizarre. Their stomachs bulged to the point of rupturing. In addition, their mouths were stained with dark red blood and had strips of bluish meat hanging from them. The blue dots of light also leaked out from their bodies, rushing towards the white fang that was gradually straightening up. Before Klein could figure out what such a scene signified, the old man in the clergyman's cap, who was lying on top of Calvetua, stood up in a staggered manner and turned around. His eyes were flashing with a blue light, his mouth was covered in blood-red meat which he was using all his strength to bite into. In the place where his face had been stuck to, the snake's body was mangled. It was missing a lot of flesh and blood, and even its bones were almost visible. He was eating up the corpse of sea god Calvetua. Klein frowned, roughly understanding what was happening. After Calvetua's death, the priest and guards in the hall lost control and began to frantically devour its flesh and blood. At this point in time, the Beyonder characteristics had yet to appear completely. Calvetua's body still contained a large part of it, and many guards had problems with a potion overdose or conflicting pathway characteristics. They broke down on the spot and died completely. However, there were always people who were lucky enough to survive the sudden death, or there were those who lost control of themselves and became disgusting monsters, or those who directly skipped a few sequences and became a powerhouse, or those who became lunatics with distorted demonic powers due to the mixture of pathway characteristics. Regardless of which one it was extremely dangerous. Klein looked down from the surviving priest's face to see his belly bulging like a pregnant woman's. A strong burgeoning and contraction appeared there, resembling a huge heart. Chapter 548. Trick to dealing with large creatures in the ruins that was filled with seawater and was half fused with the spirit world. Klein stood at the door of the central hall, wearing full body black armor. Inside was the gigantic blue serpent's body that was being mutilated for food and the old priest with his bulging stomach. The latter's skin was a grayish-black, as though it had become desiccated from prolonged exposure to the wind. His eyes flickered with an azure-blue glow as he stared intently at the guest, who wore a black crown, as though he was considering where he should start his meal from. Without any hesitation, Klein reached into his body with his right hand and took out a brown translucent bottle. Then, he stretched out his left palm and quickly unscrewed the lid before casually flinging the biological poison bottle to a corner of the hall. In this environment, which was half submerged under the sea, other than fire of light which could consume the undead and evil, no other flames could exist. Thus, it also limited two important powers of Klein's magician sequence. Therefore, he could only push his other advantages to the limit right from the very beginning. At the same time as when he threw out the biological poison bottle, Klein's left glove quickly became resplendent, as if he was reflecting the light of the noon sun. Around his body, the undulating seawater was stained with a golden color as it spread outwards, layer after layer. This was the priest of light's power from the creeping hunger, light of purification. The old priest who had eaten part of sea god Calvetua's body was certainly not civilized and polite enough to just watch Klein prepare for battle in a chivalrous manner. The blue light in his eyes suddenly bloomed, and his bloated belly once again swelled. An ethereal, yet mournful sound came from his body, instantly covering the entire ruins. This voice was like the song of a nightingale, beautiful and also melodious at the same time. It was also cold and bone-piercing, one that penetrated right to the soul. Klein was frozen in place. Similarly, all his thoughts seemed like they had been blasted by extremely cold waves and instantly froze. The old priest's body swelled up in an instant, as if he was a resurrected Calvetua or a giant that had walked out of a mythical legend. One after another, blue slippery tentacles, all surrounded by silver lightning, emerged from under his ripped robe. They shot out and danced in the air, striking the stunned Klein. Sizzle! With a burst of silver light, Klein was sent flying before falling heavily at the doorway. The black armor on his body dimmed instantly and cracked, and he had subconsciously thrown the cane in his hand far away. His mind remained abnormally calm. In a situation where he was almost frozen, he didn't even have the thought of using paper figurine substitutes and had ended up taking on the blow head-on. If it weren't for the Dark Emperor card and Azek's copper whistle which were simultaneously reinforcing his spirit body, with him essentially being a sequence 6, he would have been seriously injured and even killed instantly. The tentacles surged over again and struck down. Klein, who was jolted awake by the electricity, agilely somersaulted away, barely dodging the attack. He glanced at the man's body. He turned around immediately and ran out the door without any hesitation. It was a determined and decisive action. Tut, tut, tut. As Klein ran and flew as though he was pathetically fleeing for his life, the old priest's silver lightning-enshrouded blue tentacles were chasing him from behind in a bid to pull him back into the hall, but Klein would nimbly change direction, dodging with his agile movements and timely somersaults. Seeing that things weren't going as he wished, The old priest's belly expanded once again, and his cold voice resounded in the ruins. But this time, Klein was prepared. Although his body remained stiff and bogged down, it was soaked by the seawater before turning into a pile of soggy paper. At last, the old priest moved. With heavy but swift steps, he attempted to catch up to his enemy. The colossal figure rushed to the door, and the colossal figure slammed onto the collapsed roof and wall with a bang. The door here was originally large enough for a creature like Calvetua to pass through, but the collapse of the ruins and the madness of this sea god before its death had caused the place to collapse. The collapsed rubble left the door with an opening that was 2 meters tall and 1 meter wide. As for the old priest, whose mind was clearly abnormal, he had slammed right into it, causing him to be stuck. Klein, who had been waiting for this opportunity, stopped and turned around. He half closed his eyes, straightened his back, and spread open his arms. A beam of golden light descended from the sky, pounding the old priest's body directly. Patches of his robe that hung over his body had ignited, and his grayish-black skin and flesh fell to the ground in chunks, melting and evaporating under the pure radiance. It was only then that Klein made out what the oddity in the old priest's belly was. The swelling was intense, especially in several areas, forming the complete outline of 2 eyes and a mouth. It was as if there was someone hiding inside the old priest's stomach, putting their face there in an attempt to escape. Bang! The old priest exerted strength with his legs, which were covered by the black serpent skin, causing him to be thrown backwards from the collapsed door. Rocks were sent flying and the seawater surged. He finally broke away from the pillar of light, but most of his body was covered in hideous wounds caused by the collapse of his flesh. Even his face was filled with signs of melting. Tut, tut, tut. The old priest's blue tentacles flailed in the air, bringing with them silver lightning as they lashed at Klein from all directions. The face, at his abdomen, would occasionally make a sound that made the spirit body quieten down. Klein engaged in either running, somersaulting, circling, or calmly twirling around with his opponent. He would go in the opposite direction when his opponent headed in one, just like a wild dance between 2 people. During this process, he relied on paper figurine substitutes to withstand the ethereal, yet cold shrieking again and again. Occasionally, he would let out a roar and use a wraith's shriek to agitate the old priest, forcefully interrupting the face in his abdomen from producing any sounds. Time passed, second by second, and the crazy, old priest who had been keeping his hands down suddenly raised them and pressed them against his stomach. He pulled with his arm, forcefully tearing the silhouette of the mouth into a gash. Blue pus gushed out of it as a dense array of sharp teeth grew out. With another roar, the seawater around him gushed towards the mouth, forming the terrifying whirlpool that Calvetua had previously created. Klein, who was dressed as the Dark Emperor, was sucked in, and the lightning tentacles around him were retracted, about to embrace him. Klein didn't panic, and the glove on his left palm quickly transformed, looking as if it was made of pure gold. While floating in midair, he stared at the face on the old priest's abdomen and the seawater whirlpool below him. His eyes suddenly flashed with 2 bolts of lightning. Interrogator's psychic piercing. The old priest suddenly froze as the face in his abdomen wrinkled, and the terrifying suction force from the whirlpool instantly collapsed. In the waves that were rushing backwards, Klein lowered his body and swam through the weak spots like a fish, dodging the random flailing of the blue tentacles. He rushed to the old priest's side amidst the constantly flashing silver lightning, and at some point in time, the color of his gloves had changed to a pale green. The muscles on Klein's back bulged as he threw out 2 punches, striking the old priest's thigh in the vicinity of his knee. Bang, bang, bang. Flesh and blood splattered from the cold-emitting punches. His right leg was covered in a thin layer of frost, and the surrounding seawater was completely frozen. This was a zombie's control over ice. As the old priest cried out in pain, he retracted his whip-like tentacles, illuminating the entire ruin with silvery light. At that moment, Klein wasn't greedy and stopped just in time. He continuously somersaulted backwards, avoiding the crazy attack that scorched the stone slabs on the ground. He stood up, and while the old priest was still frozen in place, the glove on his left palm once again glowed with the color of the sun. Klein straightened up and took a pose of praising the sun. A thick, bright, and holy pillar of light descended once more, enveloping the old priest in it. Klein saw the grayish-black flesh of his enemy quickly disintegrate. The skin of the face on his enemy's abdomen melted, revealing the situation inside. Inside the old priest's abdomen, the heart, stomach, intestines, and other organs were mashed together, forming the face of a sea serpent. Calvetua actually still has a little of its soul left. The will of a demigod is truly beyond my imagination. Klein somersaulted again, dodging the blue tentacle that thrust at him like a spear. Wrapped with lightning, the tentacles, which had been melted away by the pillar of holy light, stabbed into the ground, twitching, twisting, and squirming. The bright and clear light quickly disappeared, and the sinister serpent's face on the old priest's abdomen stubbornly opened its mouth once again. At that moment, the old priest himself had bent his waist and let out a fit of violent coughs. The effort on the serpent's face came to an abrupt halt. The biological poison bottle had finally shown its effects. Klein didn't miss the opportunity. He stood up straight again and spread his arms out as though he was hugging the sun. A pillar of light with many golden flames illuminated the area. The old priest's figure first bent before shrinking, as if evaporating into thin air. The serpent face at his abdomen let out a shrill cry before completely vanishing. By the time the light dissipated, the old priest had returned to his original size. His bones had almost melted, with pieces of grayish-black flesh still hanging from his body. His aura quickly dimmed as his spirit rapidly disintegrated. Klein rushed over and, relying on his state as a wraith, began to channel his spirit. He wanted to confirm if the old priest was guilty of heinous crimes. He felt that he needed to maintain his bottom line, which was something he wished for and a precaution against corruption and madness. All of a sudden, he saw images of the old priest presiding over the living sacrificial rituals. Without hesitation, Klein reached out with his left hand to let the long-starved glove taste a delicacy. Flesh, blood, spirituality, and bone quickly surged into the gaping mouth of his palm, along with specks of blue light that came with some darkness. During the spirit channeling, Klein confirmed that the old priest was previously a soul assurer. His potion formula and beyonder ingredients all came from the Church of the God of Combat from the Faesac Empire. And by the time he became a sea god guard, he had already lost his mind and could only obey orders. After the death of Calvetua, he had followed his instincts and eaten the flesh and blood of the deity he believed in, and in the end, the conflicting characteristics turned him into a monster. Just as creeping hunger was satiated, all the beyonder characteristics on the ground suddenly stirred, turning into a hurricane and sweeping into the hall before plunging into the white fong that was no longer curved. When Klein looked over, he saw that Calvetua's remnant corpse had completely collapsed into something that resembled mud. As for the serpent fong, which had absorbed all the beyonder characteristics of the area, it had become a short scepter, quietly embedded in a half-collapsed pillar. On the tip of the white scepter, there were many tiny blue gems embedded there. Some of them dyed in black and others with the light of dawn. Seeing that creeping hunger was satiated, Klein rushed into the hall, cautiously approaching the scepter. Before he really came into contact with the scepter, he heard layers of illusory prayers ringing in his ears, and he saw illusions. He saw worshippers prostrating and praying, as well as members of the resistance crying over the shattered statues of their god. Chapter 549. High Elf. As the layered sounds of the illusory pleas rang in his ears, Klein felt as though he possessed a corporeal body. The deepest part of his head throbbed with pain, so much so that he yearned to slam his head into the wall to alleviate the pain with more pain. The scenes of different people praying to him made him feel an uncontrollable and abnormally terrifying sense of dizziness. It was as if he was walking the edge of a deep abyss and could fall down at any moment. It was only because he had his spirit body reinforced with the Dark Emperor card and Azek's copper whistle, as well as being accustomed to being prayed to, which had prevented him from losing control straight away like other non-demigod beyonders. They would have already collapsed to the ground in pain, turning into a monster or erupting into a mess of flesh and blood. All of the Beyonder characteristics in this area have combined together to form a sealed artifact with the help of the Serpent Fong. Moreover, the degree of danger and negative effects have far surpassed that of a Grade 2 sealed artifact. Klein didn't rashly move forward but instead took a few steps back and left the area where the praying voices were concentrated to ease the pain and dizziness that would have caused his spirit body to collapse. He stood next to Calvetua's mashed body, which resembled slush, and he stared at the white scepter that was embedded in the half-collapsed pillar. He considered how he could take it away. At the same time, he naturally chose a name for the sealed artifact. See God Scepter. Yes, from the feelings and reaction just now, I can barely get close to it and pull it out, but I can only last a few seconds. There's no way for me to hold it or use it. However, it doesn't matter. Once I have it in my hand, I'll terminate the summoning ritual and return above the gray fog. There, I can effectively block the thousands of prayers and any of the still unknown negative effects. It will allow me to study it with ease. Klein quickly came up with an idea. In his wraith state, he could instinctively communicate with the spirit world to receive a revelation without the need to toss a coin. His spiritual intuition told him that doing so wouldn't be too dangerous. After making up his mind, Klein began to clean up the mess and take the opportunity to see what he could find in the ancient elven ruins. He first headed to the corner and picked up the translucent biological poison bottle, screwed the lid back on, and stuffed it into his body. Then he turned around to find an iron cigar case that was half hidden beneath the slushy remains of Calvetua. I thought it had been swallowed by Calvetua and corroded into dregs. Klein clicked his tongue in wonder and quickly walked over. Because he had been left feeling numb from the discharged electric currents from the seawater, he raised his right hand, allowing the iron cigar case to float slowly in the air before landing in his palm. Klein glanced around and saw that the surface of the iron cigar case was covered with corrosion marks. However, it was still barely usable. As for the other items that were sucked away by the seawater whirlpool back then, there were no signs of them. The aura of the gray fog made Calvetua uncomfortable, so it vomited it out right away. Or has this iron cigar case undergone some sort of mutation that makes it not prone to corrosion, allowing it to survive until Calvetua died? Amidst his puzzlement, Klein placed the cigar case into his body, planning to study it after he left. Under such circumstances, he was in a race against time. He couldn't afford even the slightest delay, because Klein didn't know when the Church of Storms and the kingdom's military would find this place. He walked around the half-collapsed pillar from a distance and entered the rear of the hall, which had almost completely collapsed. There should have been many murals here, but with the destruction of the walls, they had all disappeared. Klein flew all the way to the end before seeing about a third of an exquisite throne being buried by stones and pillars. On the left side of the throne, there was half of a mural that depicted a confrontation between two figures. Looking down on the enemy from above was a man treading waves with dark clouds above him. He seemed to have storms draped over him as he had relatively softer features. His contours had an oriental trait from Klein's past life. He held a spear formed of pure lightning in his hand against an ocean that had drowned everything. Beneath the man was a man wearing a simple white robe. His face was blurry, and it was difficult to discern his age. It was only barely possible to tell that he was a man. There was a halo behind the head of the white-robed man. It quietly emitted a bright light like the sun. Beneath his feet was an illusionary circle with 12 segments. Each segment had symbols representing different times. Behind him was a shadow that was like a curtain, and within the shadows, it appeared as though there was an eye peeking out from it. Relying on his solid foundation in mysticism and rich knowledge from many sources, Klein quickly made an interpretation. Waves, storms, dark clouds, lightning. This should be the ancient god, elf King Sanayathrim. Indeed, he's just like the legends, with the rather soft facial features of an elf. This ancient lord of storms doesn't give off any irascible vibes, and his looks are surprisingly good. This is a mural in an elven ruin, so it's normal for them to beautify their own deity. The sun-like halo and the 12 circular segments that symbolizes time, isn't this the father of Aman and Adam, the creator who's known in the outside world as the ancient sun god and is revered in the city of silver as the omnipotent and omniscient god? There's a shadow curtain behind him, and behind it hides an eye. Yes, one of the images of the true creator is the eye behind the shadow curtains. As expected, this is the creator who took back the ancient god's authorities with 8 king of angels following him? Is this mural a depiction of elf king Sennayathrim's battle against the creator? Klein retracted his gaze and began searching for something of value. Following his spiritual intuition, he came to the throne, reached into the base of the collapsed stones and pillars, and pulled out an object. It was a flattened golden wine cup. Its surface was engraved with intricate patterns, and its wine leg was already bent. At the bottom was a row of elven words, Calamity, Kohainam. The original owner of this ruin is a high elf named Kohainam. Did he, or should I say, he, have the title of Calamity? It matches the Book of Calamity that Letitia and company found. Both ruins should belong to the high elf, Kohainam, and there should be some kind of miraculous connection between them. Unfortunately, this golden wine cup is just a simple wine cup. It carries a bit of spirituality simply because it's inscribed with the true name of the high elf. If Kohainam hadn't fallen, just a real name would imbue the wine cup with extraordinary powers. What a pity! Klein initially judged that Kohainam was completely dead because sea god Calvetua had inherited his powers. However, Klein couldn't be too sure, because despite it being hundreds or thousands of years later, the Book of Calamity still had the quality of driving Letitia, a beyonder whose sequence wasn't too low, to lose control. Furthermore, it doesn't seem like it's something sea god Calvetua was capable of. Could the high elf, Kohainam, have the ability to split his beyonder characteristics? Calvetua only inherited a portion. Most of the remaining beyonder characteristics is the source of the Book of Calamity's unique quality. Kohainam is dead, but he hasn't completely perished? Of course, Calvetua, who swallowed Kohainam's beyonder characteristic, was just a beast without intelligence. No one knows what happened at that time. Perhaps some of the characteristics were lost and formed a sealed artifact. After Calvetua's defeat, it fell into the hands of the Church of Storms. Yes, I'll ask little son via the world at the tarot gathering next week. He should know who Kohainam is. Actually, there's no need to ask, he'll be offering 2 pages of ancient god legends. Perhaps there might be a detailed description of high elves next time. After thinking it through, Klein stuffed the wine cup into his body. After all, this was made of gold, and even if the high elf, Kohainam, wasn't dead and had some sort of connection with the wine cup, the gray fog could still block him out. After a thorough check, and seeing that there was nothing of note, Klein quickly flew back outside and picked up the black hardwood cane before wiping out any traces of the battle. Then, he took out a paper figurine. With a casual shake, he threw it into the seawater, causing it to quickly turn soggy before reducing to dust. The earlier parts can be interfered with, but I won't have the time or opportunity for the rest. Luckily, I am now disguised as Dark Emperor. As for the remains of Calvetua, his flesh no longer have any value, and his bones are too heavy. It might affect my ability to wield the sea god scepter. With the help of cogitation, Klein stabilized his state and quickly flew towards the white bone staff on the half-collapsed pillar. Again, the sounds of illusory pleas filled his ears. Either pious, crying, fanatic, or numbed worshippers filled his vision, and the throbbing and dizziness became more and more intense. Relying on his rich experience and the spirit-body reinforcement from using the Dark Emperor card and Azek's copper whistle, Klein barely managed to hold on until he finally arrived beside the sea god scepter. He extended his right hand, and he grasped the middle section of the white-boned scepter. As soon as the two made contact, the scene before Klein's eyes became clear, and the buzzing sound beside his ears instantly became real. He saw the bald, wheelchair-bound rebel, Kalat, collapsed on the ground, struggling to reach the shattered figurine of Calvetua, chanting its honorific name over and over, his eyes filled with despair. He saw Edmonton, with his blue sea serpent tattoo, prostrating himself in front of another Calvetua figurine which was strangely bleeding, constantly knocking his head against the ground, creating a bloody mess. In the slums, he saw believers hiding in their homes, weeping and praying numbly. Klein's black armor couldn't support his body anymore as it quickly collapsed. At the same time, his solidified muscles tightened as he exerted strength with his hands. Amidst the layers of resonating prayers and numerous clear scenes, he suddenly pulled out the short white bone staff that symbolized the sea god's authority. The seawater in the ruins surged violently, either churning or transforming into a whirlpool. Klein calmly held onto the sea god's scepter with his pitch-black crown before immediately vanishing. He directly returned above the gray fog. When the familiar towering palace entered his sight, the sounds of praying and the hallucinatory scenes in front of him had already disappeared. Sitting on the high-back chair belonging to the fool, Klein lifted his right hand and examined the sea god's scepter inlaid with blue gems and stained with some darkness and the light of dawn. Countless points of light floated around the sealed artifact. Each point of light seemed to correspond to a praying believer. This caused the milky white body of the scepter to glow with psychedelic and holy streams of light. At this moment, Klein felt like this scepter was the true body of the sea god. Chapter 550. The negative effects of the sealed artifact. After some wrestling with the sea god's scepter, Klein gained a preliminary understanding of its powers. It could create tsunamis, create hurricanes, produce torrential rain, and bring forth lightning. It could allow a person to fly in the sky and roam the seabed with almost no restrictions. It was nearly indestructible and could be used to smash an enemy's head in. It allowed the wielder to never get lost without the existence of any other powerful factors. It would provide an unimaginable level of balance, drive many sea creatures to do one's bidding, respond to prayers from believers, and also allow the wielder to obtain the same kind of strength as a sea monster. It was equivalent to making the wielder the ruler of an entire expanse of the sea. To Klein, this was already considered at the level of a deity. Even on Earth, he could resist an aircraft carrier formation. Although he was sequence 6 with plenty of pragmatic beyonder powers, making him a genuine powerhouse, a legendary figure, in the eyes of ordinary people, he was still weak in essence. He was still closer to man rather than God. If the situation was right, a revolver would be able to finish him off. Of course, his resurrection and act of climbing out of a coffin was a whole other matter. As for the powers of the sea god scepter, they had all surpassed the level of man. In the folklore and in the hearts of the common man, he possessed the powers of deities and devils. No wonder beyonders are called demigods from sequence 4. They truly are more like God than man. Klein silently sighed with emotion, and then he made a self-deprecating comment. If I use the sea god scepter under normal circumstances, I can already be a high-ranking deacon of the Nighthawks, becoming one of the 20-odd people with the most power in the church. If Nsangwil didn't have 0-08 and was at sea, I could immediately seek revenge on him. There might even be a small chance of success. But can I use the sea god scepter normally? Klein had already discovered that the negative effects of the sea god scepter were staggering. In the Church of Evernight, it could easily obtain the evaluation of a Grade 1 sealed artifact, and countless researchers would have to die to figure out the best sealing and usage methods. The sea god scepter had a total of 3 negative effects. First, it made the wielder irritable, making them prone to anger and turning rash as a result. Second, it periodically froze all thoughts of biological creatures in a certain range before draining their blood, including the wielders. As for how huge the range was and what the exact period was, Klein, who wasn't a professional researcher, couldn't give a precise description. He could only give a rough estimate that the range was from 600 meters to 1 kilometer and the period was 20 minutes to 35 minutes. Third, it would gather and display the prayers of worshippers, both audio and visual. This very easily caused a non-demigod wielder, who had a lacking spirit, to break down and lose control. The first negative effect is still alright. If I were to only use it for a short period of time, the anger and irritation would still be acceptable. To put it simply, I'll just end things rashly with such a powerful sealed artifact. For the third, there's actually a way to avoid it. The sea god's response to its believers must have a distance limitation. That is to say that beyond the Rørsted archipelago and the nearby sea regions, there would be no signal, so one wouldn't be influenced by it. Yes, if it's constantly placed above the gray fog, I believe this can break the distance limitation. The prayer's voices and scenes would be screened, turning into points of light. It wouldn't affect me in any way. I can then choose whether to reply, who to reply to, and how to reply. And when replying, I can use the powers of the sea god scepter. The biggest problem is the second one. I myself am fine. As Dark Emperor, I'm considered a wraith. I wouldn't have blood, so there's no need to be afraid of being sucked dry. However, the surrounding creatures will be in trouble. After all, it doesn't distinguish between friend and foe. Besides, the frequency is quite unpredictable. It's impossible for me to first discuss with the enemy when I encounter danger about changing our time and place. Klein carefully thought about certain scenarios of him using the sea god scepter, but it all depended on the environment and accurate judgment, so it wasn't very feasible. Phew, could its fate be to stay above the gray fog? When people like Amon attempt to creep up, I'll give them a bashing, no, a bolt of lightning. Yes, there's another usage method. When people like Miss Justice and Mr. Hanged Man seek my help, I'm no longer limited to using paper angels. I can provide rain and produce some wind. Of course, this can be done like the purifying powers of the sun brooch, using the paper angel as a vessel. On some serious thought, I can fully appear like a true demigod above the gray fog, with the help of the sea god scepter. Klein's mood gradually became better, as he had discovered that the sea god scepter wasn't completely unusable at the moment. It opened up many more options and avenues for him. He withdrew his attention and once again looked at the white bone scepter with the blue gems embedded at the top. He pondered over another question, and that was whether or not he should respond to the prayers of the followers of the sea god. Calvetua is already dead. There's no need to give those people another target of their faith. But, even if the living priests and high-ranking members of the resistance notice the abnormality and no longer receive any responses, they still wouldn't accept the worst outcome for a long period of time. People will often hold out hope and are accustomed to comforting themselves and hypnotizing themselves. This is especially the case when they're in a perilous situation with no hope to be seen. Just like the City of Silver, after 2,000 years, they're still consecrating the Creator, believing that they had been abandoned and that they would receive a response one day. That is to say that the fervent believers of the sea god will not stop their live sacrifices just because they didn't receive a response, being unconvinced that Calvetua has already perished. Instead, they will become worse, hoping to gain the favor of their god. Without years of promotions and setbacks, it will be difficult for them to realize the truth. Without the support of a native deity like Calvetua, the resistance would probably fall entirely into Faisak's or Intis's camp. At that time, they would most likely be driven to do inhuman things, such as attacking places where civilians gather, or to make children who still retain their innocence act as meat shields. I need to give them some guidance. I need to tell them what the correct way of practicing their faith is, but I should only help them without burdening myself. I'm not responsible for saving their fates. Klein gently rapped the edge of the long, mottled table and suddenly chuckled. Wasn't I supposed to act? Sea god Calvetua is quite a good target. I wonder if I'll get any feedback with the gray fog's interference. Heh, I have to give it a try to figure it out. Klein quickly made his decision, feeling strangely refreshed. He deliberated for a moment. First, he conjured a necessary scene, then he held onto the sea god scepter, spreading out his spirituality before touching one of the points of light. In a hidden cave in the forest of Blue Mountain Island, the bald rebel, Kalat, fell from his wheelchair, his eyes filled with despair and confusion as he crawled towards the shattered figurine of Calvetua in front of him. He vaguely sensed something, but he was unwilling to believe it. This meant that all of his persistence, all of his sacrifices, and all of his pain would become meaningless. No, he screamed silently as he constantly muttered the honorific name of sea god Calvetua in an attempt to get a response from the deity. With his elbows on the ground, his fingers reached into the soil as he moved towards the front of the shattered figurine 1 inch at a time. He picked up the head of the sea serpent that was carved out of stone, and he found that its eyes had collapsed inwardly to become a strange black hole, and its fangs were falling off one after another. Kalat seemed to freeze, the light in his eyes seemingly vanishing. It was at this moment that he suddenly saw a blurry figure. Behind the figure was a dark blue tsunami surging into the sky and streaks of silver lightning that branched out like tree branches. Amidst his shock, Kalat instinctively lowered his head, an unimaginable sense of joy surging inside him. He saw that the figure's feet were surrounded by waves, and there were hurricanes swirling around him. The figure was majestic and holy, high and almighty. Then he heard a calm and magnificent voice. "I have returned." As his voice echoed in the air, Kalat teared up for some inexplicable reason. 10 minutes after Klein left the bottom of the sea ruin, which was half merged with the spirit world, the seawater that filled this place suddenly churned and flowed backward. In just 20 to 30 seconds, the inside of the elven ruin was so dry that it resembled dry land. A fresh hurricane blew in, bringing in breathable gas. One figure after another descended from the hurricane, and leading them was a tall and brawny middle-aged man. He appeared to be in his 40s with a face with firm and deep lines. His accentuated muscles filled with loose storm priest robes. He was none other than the Church of Storm's Cardinal, Archbishop of the Rorstad Sea, high-ranking deacon of the mandated Punishers, Sea King John Cotman. He had a pair of deep blue eyes, and his hair of the same color was twice as thick as a normal person's. They were like small worms or tentacles. Behind John Cotman were a number of mandated Punishers and military personnel. They examined their surroundings expectantly and cautiously, not letting their guard down because of the demigod's protection up ahead. At this moment, they heard a snort, and they were immediately swept up by a hurricane, arriving at the doorway of the ruin in one fell swoop. They saw a huge sea serpent reduced to a sludge of flesh and blood, with its bone exposed. Other than that, there was nothing else. "Who is it?" John Cotman suppressed his anger and growled. As he shouted these words, a sea wave crashed down from above. The sea wave reverberated in the half-collapsed hull, quickly calming to form a windless lake. The surface of the lake reflected the scene from before, an indiscernible figure pulling up a short white staff inlaid with blue gems, causing the sea to churn and the ruins to quake. John Cotman took a deep breath and turned his back to the crowd. "Find him." At that moment, Klein had selected a dozen or so believers to respond to, each of whom was relatively important, mainly by giving out a new covenant. "I have returned. When the past is pardoned, I will redeem you." First commandment: Thou shalt not sacrifice unto me living human sacrifices. Chapter 551. The 10 Commandments, Second Commandment. Thou shalt not use my name in vain. Third Commandment. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Fourth Commandment. Honor thy father, thy mother, and thy children as you love me. Fifth Commandment. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Sixth Commandment. Thou shalt not kill the innocent. Seventh Commandment. Thou shalt not bear false witness, frame, or violate contracts. Eighth Commandment. Serve me with your heart, not with your offerings. Ninth Commandment. Those who have committed lesser wrongdoings, first atone for your sins before seeking forgiveness. 10th Commandment. Honor my name by helping your compatriots and companions. One commandment after another echoed in the ears of the bald rebel, Kalat, causing him to completely prostrate himself. He held his head close to the ground, uncontrollably trembling slightly with reverence, fear, and excitement. As a mid-sequence beyonder, a rebel who had once been educated in the Faesak Empire, he had sufficient insight to understand that the worship of the sea god was based more on fear of powerful forces, fear of the fearsome natural risks that mankind faced, and many rituals that retained primitive bloodshed, a backward faith that reveled in inhumane and uncivilized practices, something that would be eliminated sooner or later. However, the faith he had developed since he was young had made him afraid to go against the divine revelation. He could only bury the idea of modifying the ritual process deep in his heart and avoid the parts which conflicted with his own wishes as much as possible. Now, The sea god's sudden change left him extremely delighted. It was as if he could see the so-called primitive totem that outsiders claimed it to be, evolving into a true god. Blessed are we, blessed are the rebels, blessed are the true believers. In his blurred vision, Kalat raised his head, spread his hands sincerely, and placed them against his mouth. I will abide by your teachings as if I am praising your name. The blurry figure in front of him disappeared, the magnificent voice by his ears vanished, and the scene in the cave returned to its original state. However, Kalat knew that everything was no longer the same. He moved his elbows several times and quickly crawled back to his wheelchair. He once again sat on it and turned to the other side of the cave. Kalat quickly met with Edmonton. This member of the resistance with a blue sea serpent tattoo was standing in front of the deity figurine that was bleeding abnormally. His forehead was a mix of scarlet, red and black, dirty and gruesome. However, Edmonton's expression was joyful, excited, and satisfied. He looked at Kalat and blurted out, "Did you receive the revelation?" "Yes, it's the aura of God, just like before." Kalat nodded in excitement. Not only has God rebuilt the earth, but he has also rebuilt his covenant. Edmonton let out a sigh of relief. I was even suspecting that I was hallucinating before. It seems like as long as an outsider touches the holy sword, God will be able to walk the land again. There's no need for it to be completely lifted. Kalat chimed, "Indeed. The reason why the deity figurine shattered and bled is because God has changed his image. We must build a new one. Just like the scenes we saw earlier." God also showed his sacred emblem. Above the symbol of the waves, there was a scepter in the shape of lightning, surrounded by strong winds, Edmonton said as he recalled. Kalat immediately patted the armrest of his wheelchair. "Let's find the high priest right now. He should have also received the revelation. We will usher in a new world." Above the gray fog, Klein put down the sea god's scepter and rubbed his temples in exhaustion. He had noticed a problem earlier. The sea god's scepter could respond to ritualistic magic, which meant that it could provide a certain amount of strength to help the worshipper complete the ritual and achieve their goals. However, it could only be concentrated within his domain and could not exceed the limit. Whatever could be done was relatively limited. For example, the Evernight goddess could use a method of influencing fate to let her believers naturally obtain the money they needed and pay their debt. As for the sea god scepter, it could at most produce fake money on the altar, and after a while, it would become ineffective and return to its true form. This is the difference between a false god and a true god. Besides, apart from the gray fog, as long as it fulfills the procedure and prayer, the sea god scepter is capable of automatically responding to ritualistic magic, unless it will use up more than half of its power in one go. This might be why the steps to ritualistic magic are extremely important. Above the gray fog, prayers will be screened, reduced to points of light. The sea god scepter is unable to automatically respond, hence, requiring me to manually handle them. This makes it relatively troublesome. It's impossible for me to stay here all day. Of course, there's also a benefit to it. As long as the prayer doesn't have any mistakes, and it is accurately pointed towards the sea god scepter, regardless of how perfunctory the ritual is, they will be able to receive a response. The only criteria is that I'm in a good mood. I'll think of a solution when I'm free. I'll make it so that even if the sea god scepter is above the gray fog, it will be an automated answering machine. Produce a paper angel? That's useless, as it doesn't have any soul injected into it. Make a mechanical and rigid puppet to handle the repeated and trivial ritualistic magic? I wonder if a nimble rite master has powers related to this. At the very least, Rosago only showed traits of controlling a person like a puppet. As Klein's thoughts slowly settled, his eyes moved to the iron cigar case. After some research, he discovered that this cigarette case that had a severely corroded exterior had undergone some abnormal changes. It was firmer, tougher, and more resistant to corrosion. However, it was still within a comprehensible and acceptable range of normal humans. It isn't equipped with any special properties. However, if it were placed here for a few years, decades, or even longer where it holds beyonder characteristics and mystical items, perhaps it could really evolve into a sealing case, whose effects would gradually fade one day. The corner of Klein's mouth twitched, and he turned his head to look at the junk pile in the corner. They were covered by the gray fog, almost blending in with the surroundings. Klein laughed dryly and looked away. He fiddled with the crushed golden wine cup again, confirming that there was nothing wrong with it. After doing all this, he entered the real world and summoned himself once more to bring the sun brooch and other items back to his room in the inn. At this very moment, the clouds in the sky had disappeared, and the moon was scattering its crimson tranquility. The entire city of generosity, Byam, remained asleep in its dreams. 9. Cathedral of Waves. Alger was summoned, and by using the excuse of a confession he once again met the diocese bishop, Chogo. Look for this person. Chogo handed over the portrait in his hand. Another mission. What's going on recently? Alger muttered in his mind as he unfolded the piece of paper. When he saw the contents of the portrait, he almost couldn't control his laughter. It was impossible to tell if the figure in the portrait was male or female, or what they looked like. How was he supposed to find them? In a split second he thought of something and didn't try to hide his change in mood. Instead, he deliberately blurted out, "Who is this?" The portrait depicted an unusually blurry and mysterious person, with no characteristics that could be used to aid in a search. There was no such mission yesterday. A sudden demand to pursue this person this morning. What happened last night? Calvetua perished completely. With that happening, the church and the military would definitely search for its remains. Simim Island is the clue? This person took away the most important item ahead of them? Who is this person? Alger's heart skipped a beat, and he almost didn't dare meet Chogo's eyes. Chogo nodded. A dirty, despicable thief. He may be from Intis or Fasak, and he may belong to the Church of the Eternal Blazing Sun or the Church of the God of Combat. Someone from Intis or Fasak, or someone from the Church of the Eternal Blazing Sun or the Church of the God of Combat. Why would there be such a guess and conclusion? His Eminence John Cotman only received little information at the scene and was unable to pinpoint the target. In this case, it's indeed possible to presume that this person is from either Intis or Fasak, as the main supporters of the resistance and Calvetua are from those two countries. There is reason to believe that they may have already known where Calvetua was hiding. It fits my theory from before. Of course, it could also be something else. Alger controlled his emotions and asked, "What did he do?" "You don't need to know. Just pay attention to any abnormalities from people from Intis or Fasak in Byam. Yes, also include the locals who have become Beyonders. Also, find the people who previously posted the notice on the front door of the cathedral. They might know something and they could quickly give you further information," George ordered in a deep voice. This is indeed a direction. This is tantamount to telling me that this person has something to do with the notice and the perishing of Calvetua. I wonder whose hands Calvetua's Beyonder characteristic landed in. Who? Right, the world is in Byam. Something happened to Calvetua not long after he came here. Could this be Mr. Fool's purpose? Would this help him in the process of removing the seal and regaining his strength? Alger's pupils contracted as he recalled his conjecture from a while ago. When he woke up, Klein, who had reaped a bountiful harvest last night, was uplifted and in a good mood. He decided to treat himself today and make sure that his 3 meals would be sumptuous and delicious. As he pushed open the door and walked into the living room, he saw that Danitz was out of bed, untying the bandage and splint around his arm. He recovered that quickly? Klein was stunned for a moment. Seeing Gehrman Sparrow look over, Danitz chuckled and said, "My ability at recovering isn't too bad. My sequence 9 is called Hunter. I received a clear improvement in various aspects of my body, allowing me to surpass ordinary humans. When it comes to combat, I experienced a great enhancement. Besides, I'm already at sequence 7. Sequence 9 Hunter? I've killed one, and I know the corresponding sequence S-axis name is Conspiracist." Klein suddenly recalled the first enemy he encountered back when he first arrived in Backland. It had sucked him into a maelstrom that he was almost unable to extricate himself from. Sequence 8, Provoker? Klein asked in passing. He had long since guessed Danit's beyonder pathway from his adeptness at using fire. It was the Red Priest pathway which Roselle had called a true man. Sequence 7 was called the Pyromaniac, also known in ancient times as Fire Mage. Danitz froze for a second, thinking that Gehrman Sparrow was doubting him. He subconsciously raised his voice. Do you think I'm not good at provoking? No, I'm an expert in this field. Chapter 552. Pomp. Danitz threw the splint and bandages into the trash, flexed his left arm, and said, Typically, a pirate's provocation is an insult, but I'm different. I do targeted insults. This requires one to grasp a lot of information and rumors, and also understand the provocation target. Only by doing this will you be able to make him lose his mind and cause his brain to be burnt out with a single sentence. He paused for a second and said, just like with steel. You can curse him, calling him dog's hit, or you could curse his parents and captain, but that will be useless. However, if you do an action and throw in a line with that, he will definitely turn into a bull who only sees red. With that, Danitz put his hands on his hips, held his crotch, and shouted in a low, scornful voice, Bitch! I really want to hit him. He lives up to being a provoker. Indeed, Steel Mavady has such tendencies and hobbies. Klein loosened his subconsciously clenched fists. This is what you call professional provocation. Danitz spread out his hands in conclusion. If I meet a beast, a monster, or someone who cannot be communicated with since they had lost control, I can proactively emit a feeling that they hate. This is a beyonder power. People with such beyonder powers would either be great at receiving beatings, or they would be great at escaping. Clearly you belong to the latter. Klein cursed inwardly. Without having to worry about his injured left arm, Danitz was in a good mood as he continued, Actually, I'm very good at setting up traps. It's a pity that you didn't agree with my plan when hunting Steel Mavady. Klein resisted the twitching of his mouth as he calmly replied, You still have a chance. What chance? Danitz asked out of curiosity. A chance to set up traps for beyonders such as Steel. One by one, I'll introduce you to them. Klein smiled. Danitz was momentarily at a loss for words. He knew very well that traps were often ineffective against a man who wasn't afraid of guns, projectiles, fire, or water. Danitz let out a hollow chuckle and turned to look out the window. The weather has cleared up. Does that mean that the serpent, Calvetua, is dead? Klein answered tersely without hiding the truth. Danitz exhaled, hesitated, then said, Regardless, after this citywide sweep, few pirates will dare come to Byam for some time. This will definitely include Admiral of Blood. Your plan of hunting him with Captain might have to come to an end. The Sonia Sea is so big, so it's very difficult to find a fleet that intentionally hides their whereabouts. Moreover, they can head for the Fog Sea, Berserk Sea, North Sea, and Polar Sea. If it was that easy to kill a pirate admiral at sea, the church and the military would have done it a long time ago. Let me return to the Golden Dream as soon as possible. Danitz lampooned under his breath. Don't worry, I have a way, and this will be your job. Klein asked without batting an eyelid, What's your captain's opinion? He had already spent £12 to obtain a radio receiver through furs, but he had been too busy with matters regarding the sea god to bother with it. Hence, he hadn't taken it out from the junk pile above the grey fog to bring to the real world. Meanwhile, Klein had received the money from Miss Justice and Mr. Hanged Man, raising his fortune to £7,085 and 5 gold coins. A wealth at this level was enough to buy a rather large and productive manor anywhere. If it wasn't for my revenge and my hope of finding a way back to Earth, I could have already retired. Klein thought in satisfaction. Captain's opinion. Danitz forced a smile and said, Although Captain and the others should have entered within a 500 nautical mile radius, in theory, allowing the attempt of a soulfall ritual, you should know that the sea routes aren't entirely safe. Pirates have to be careful not to get caught by the military or the church. For this, they often need to take detours. I believe we should wait another day before doing the soulfall ritual so as to prevent any wastage of energy and materials. Okay. Klein didn't give any affirmative answers and had turned towards the washroom. He planned on heading out again today to search for a chance to act as another person. Seeing Gehrman Sparrow's back, Danitz exhaled. I must first contact Captain in private and persuade her to let me return to the Golden Dream before I can use the Soul Fall ritual in front of you. Gehrman Sparrow is someone who likes to head out. I have plenty of opportunities and space. Heh, don't tell me that he enjoys shopping? Danitz thought, curling his lips. After leaving the Cathedral of Waves, Alger Wilson went straight for the Ralph Trading Company in Reflection and found the owner, who was reading a newspaper. He was well aware that this middle-aged man, in formal attire, a bow tie and glasses, was a veteran pirate. He supported the resistance in secret and reverently worshipped sea god Calvetua. What is it, our captain of a ghost ship? Ralph put down the newspaper, crossed his right foot over his left, and smiled leisurely. He was an illegitimate child. His father was an adventurer of Lone and Faysac blood, and his mother was a native. He had made his fortune by becoming a pirate, then being a merchant that did business with both pirates and the officials. He established a vast network of connections that provided him with help at the Governor General's office, the city council, and the police station. Upon hearing Ralph's question, Alger almost frowned, because the man's attitude and tone were rather abnormal. This abnormality was a state that wasn't in accordance with Alger's expectations. In his opinion, after the fall of sea god Calvetua, he was certain that there would definitely be bad omens in the Rorstad archipelago. The pious believers would definitely sense that something was amiss, either feeling apprehensive or downcast, so how could they still be so relaxed and natural? Alger didn't directly mention Calvetua. Instead, he chuckled and asked, "Do you know where Kovaro has been recently?" Kovaro was the pirate captain who possessed the Beyonder characteristic of the Sanguine Baron. It was said that he was once a sailor aboard the Dark Emperor, and that he was part of the periphery forces of the King of the Five Seas, Nast. Who knows? But he's surely not in Byam, otherwise, he would have been caught in the raids in the past 2 days. Ralph shrugged his shoulders. I heard that his boat went south. Alger actually had an appointment with Kovaro on this matter, and he was only using it as a way to start the conversation. Of course, he was well aware that to avoid the tsunami in the waters of the Rorstad archipelago, Kovaro had definitely gone far away and would take some time before he returned to Byam. However, Alger wasn't too anxious, as he already knew that Mr. Moon had been given an acceptance draft. If he withdrew the sum before its maturity, he would receive a discounted value and lose a large amount of interest. He deliberately nodded his head and said, "Got it, thank you for telling me." At this point, Alger pretended to be unaware of what happened as he asked, "I heard that many sea god figurines in many places shattered by themselves?" He hadn't witnessed any instances of this himself, but he could make a reasonable deduction based on the church's archives. In many of the colonial islands and countries of the southern continent, more than 1 or 2 false gods like Calvetua had been finished off by the 7 churches. What happened after their deaths had already long been recorded in the archives. Ralph calmly nodded. Yes, there was such a thing. But that's not bad news. His expression turned fervent. Because God has appeared over the land once again in a new image. God has reappeared over the land once again with a new image? Alger's eyes remained fixed on him, and he felt that this was both reasonable but also unexpected. Judging from the Church of Storm's reaction, he was certain that Calvetua was already dead. Then which sea god was responding to the believers now? Connecting it with his previous judgment, he quickly came up with a bold idea. Is it an embodiment of Mr. Fool? He used sea god Calvetua's perishing to create a new identity? He can release his powers through the seal to directly affect an identity in the real world? Is this the real reason for the world to come to buy him? Hiss, Mr. Fool really does things with pomp. Alger secretly swallowed his saliva and suppressed his excitement. In the Wind of Azure Inn, Klein, who had yet to leave, saw the stack of cash Captain Eland handed him. Here is your reward for a total of £100. He didn't mention how much Gehrman Sparrow and Danitz each received, but he gave a total amount. As for how exactly they would split the reward, that was something he left to them. The military is really generous. Klein silently mused as he received the thick stack of cash, instinctively taking out 2 5-pound notes and tossing them to Danitz. He lowered his wrist and finally drew another 2 10-pound notes in an expressionless manner. Sparrow is still far more than just Eland. Danitz put away the reward in pleasant surprise. His wallet that had slimmed down quite significantly over the past couple of days had finally been replenished. Glancing at Sparrow in his new clothes, Eland asked, after some deliberation, with his boat-shaped hat in hand, "News from the Church of Storms has revealed that the person who posted the notices on the cathedral's door, informing them of the problem between Letitia and sea god Calvetua, was Blazing Danitz. What do you think about that?" He stared straight into Danitz's eyes and waited for an answer. "Ah." Danitz gave a hollow chuckle. "I don't know him." Klein was silent for 2 seconds before saying, "While fulfilling a dead adventurer's wish, I came across Letitia and her companions at the inn. Snakes invaded our place in the middle of the night, but they easily resolved it. After returning to Byam, I went to purchase some items from the Resistance and discovered that they had taken out their holy sword. Furthermore, there were 2 mid-sequence Beyonders guarding that small base. I felt a crazy will invade my body just by making contact with that holy sword for a moment, and I had nearly lost control on the spot. They were still after Letitia." What Klein said was the truth. It wasn't the entire truth, but it was enough to infer the contents of the announcement. Even if the kingdom's military and the Church of Storms were to investigate further, they would only be able to unearth the fact that Sparrow could change his appearance. After listening carefully, Eland sighed and smiled. "If there are such things in the future, you don't have to post notices in the middle of the night. You can come find me directly. This will allow you to reap even greater rewards." He stood up, put on his hat, and said to Danitz, "I heard that the bounty for Blazing is going to rise again." Chapter 553. Danitz's Hard Work Bounty. The muscles in Danitz's cheek twitched as he forced a smile, pretending that he wasn't blazing and that he didn't care. When Eland left, he turned sharply to face Sparrow and said, "I think we should move to another inn. No, we'd better leave Byam as soon as possible. If I'm worth a bounty of more than 5,000 pounds, I won't be safe anywhere. The pirates and adventurers who are at the same level as me would definitely rush over like sharks smelling blood. Prey that they can finish off while also proving themselves and giving them a high bounty are always very popular. They're worth no less than treasure." Danitz suppressed even more of his inward shouting. Klein didn't agree or disagree. He slowly smiled. "Are you worried that your bounty will be too high?" Danitz nodded heavily, finally feeling as though the madman, Sparrow, was finally saying something sensible. "Besides hiding, there are other solutions," Klein said as he walked over to the coat rack. "What are they?" Danitz asked subconsciously. Klein took off his half-top hat and put it on his head. "Raise your sequence. Let your strength match the bounty." He put on his coat, twisted the handle, and walked out of the suite. "Raise myself to sequence 6? Become a conspiracist?" Danitz paused for 2 seconds, then he frowned and grimaced. When he consumed the sequence 9 Hunter and sequence 8 Provoker potions, he didn't find it much of a problem. In fact, he began to long for finding the legendary treasures, obtain mid or high sequence formulas and their corresponding materials to advance to a demigod, and then become the new king of the sea. However, the intense pain and discomfort brought to him by the pyromaniac potion had left him in fear and apprehension. He didn't dare believe that he nearly lost control despite strictly following his captain's instructions of constantly provoking his opponents. This forced Danitz to consider whether or not he was fine just getting rich so that he could return to Intis a rich man. He stood there, troubled for several minutes. Finally, he thought of a question. Even if I want to advance by consuming a potion, it's not something I can do in a short period of time. I'll still have to find the formula and collect the ingredients. It wouldn't be an easy task, and the new bounty might be released tomorrow or even today. So, I must change inns and leave Byam as soon as possible. After Alger left the Ralph Trading Company, he casually went to a few places to inquire about the situation. When it was almost noon, he received a new report from the Church of Storms. It's confirmed that the person who posted the notices at the door of the cathedral is Blazing Danitz. Pay attention to his whereabouts. Blazing Danitz. Alger held the slip of paper in his hand and ruminated over the name silently. The corners of his mouth curled up, and he no longer had any doubts in his mind. With ease and certainty, he felt confident about going out to sea to hunt for materials. This was because his quest would happen at sea and because Mr. Fool has a new identity, Sea God. Having missed the morning's blue star, Danitz waited until 4 in the afternoon to attempt the soulfall ritual while Gehrman Sparrow was out. He drew the god of knowledge and wisdom's sacred emblem with familiarity, an omniscient eye on an open book, with the appropriate altar set up. Inside the wall of spirituality, he lit a candle and picked up the lavender and mint extract before dripping it onto the still-burning flame. A refreshing fragrance filled the air, and Danitz burned several more herbal powders. Having done all this, he took a step back and said in ancient Hermes, "I pray for the power of knowledge. I pray for the power of rationality. I pray for the God of wisdom's loving grace. I pray that you allow me to communicate with the spirit of Edwina Edwards, the teacher who pursues knowledge, the researcher of spirit world creatures, Vice Admiral Iceberg of the Seas, who hails from Lemberg." Along with the echo of the incantation, the interior of the altar suddenly became cold. Apart from the 3 candles, the remaining brass dagger, the salt plate, the bottle of extract, and the fountain pen and paper all floated in midair. Danitz waited nervously, not knowing what was going to happen next. After nearly 20 seconds, the flames of the 3 candles began to sway, coloring the candles in a pale green color. Danitz's body suddenly stiffened. He felt an icy chill invade his body in an irresistible manner. He saw his feet move uncontrollably, and he took a step forward. He saw his left hand rise and grab the black fountain pen and a piece of white paper. He saw himself bend over with a pen in his left hand, quickly writing, "Is there something?" The words were exquisite and artistic, very different from Danitz's own style. It was only then that Danitz realized he could control his head and his throat. "Captain, Sea God Calvetua is dead." He squeezed out his hoarse voice as though he was suffering from a heavy cold. "Details." His right hand wrote smoothly. This was the opportunity Danitz had been waiting for. He immediately recounted everything that had happened, including Gehrman Sparrow's visit to Simim Island in order to fulfill some adventurer's dying wish, the possibility that Gehrman Sparrow had suffered the sea god's curse and how he easily resolved the problem after closing the door, including the madman's mistake of mistaking the ancient elven ruins as a sea god ruin. Towards the end, Danitz quickly added his own take on the matter. "I believe that Admiral of Blood won't come to Byam for quite a substantial period of time. Most famous pirates wouldn't. It will take at least half a year for this matter to pass. Captain, your hunting plan with Gehrman Sparrow might have to be shelved for the time being. I wish to return to the Golden Dream." His left hand froze for a few seconds before writing, "Continue to follow Gehrman Sparrow, and be my contact point with him. Captain, why you can teach him the soul fall ritual." Danitz yelled hoarsely. His left hand wrote, "This can only be done within 500 nautical miles, and in the case of the person holding the ritual, it would be quite risky for him. And you have our points of contact on the various islands. Those are things that cannot be told to outsiders." Indeed, Gehrman Sparrow is just an outsider. "But, Captain, I really want to go back to the Golden Dream." Danitz racked his brains and said, "Maybe we can invite him to be a guest on the ship." "No, Suddenly an idea came to Danitz. "Captain, he has a messenger. He has a messenger. A messenger that travels through the spirit world to deliver letters for him. This should be an unrestricted means of communication, and it should be more private and secure. I don't need to be the contact person anymore." Danitz thought in abnormal delight. His left hand hung in midair for a few seconds before he wrote, "If that's the case, there's no problem. As the New Year holiday is coming to an end, it's indeed time for you to return to the ship. You do have some talent in languages, but you still have quite a few problems in other areas. You need to attend more classes and work harder." Danitz opened his mouth, but nothing came out of it. He suddenly felt that returning to the Golden Dream wasn't anything to look forward to. In the evening, Klein returned to the Wind of Azure Inn. He didn't find a suitable target for acting despite an entire day's work. Due to the sweep from before, many pirates and adventurers that were wanted were arrested. The remaining ones continued hiding cautiously, not daring to go out at all. Whether it was the bars, casinos, or brothels, business was poor and there weren't many customers. So this is the situation. Danitz came over. He cleared his throat and gave a hollow chuckle. It would be my first time using the Soulfall ritual, and I don't have much confidence. I did a test ahead of time, and it succeeded. I managed to communicate with Captain, and she believes there's no chance to hunt Admiral of Blood anytime soon. She plans on summoning me back to the Golden Dream. As for us communicating, don't you have a messenger? You can use the messenger to send Captain a letter. My messenger was given by a big shot, and it's not mine. Moreover, the messenger can only send messages back and forth between the owner and the owner of the token, without involving anyone else. Yes, it can also be between the host of a ritual and the owner. That reminds me, I have to find a way to get a messenger of my own, or many things will be inconvenient. As for the solution to this, obviously, it's to write to Mr. Azik, who has to be an expert on the matter. Klein calmly pulled over a chair and sat down. He leaned forward and said in a low voice, "Tell your captain that I have a way to find Admiral of Blood." Danitz was stunned, having not expected such an answer. Then, he saw the corners of Gehrman Sparrow's mouth slowly widen as he repeated, "Tell your captain." Danitz shivered. He didn't dare to make any inquiries as he forced a smile. "We'll have to wait until the next blue star, which is between 11 p.m. and midnight tonight." "Very good." Klein smiled as he praised. But Danitz wasn't happy at all. Klein stood up slowly, recollecting a special dish he had eaten for dinner, and he headed for the bedroom. The food was called the tiativa, and translated into Loan, it was meat within fruit. The cook used a giant local fruit, Tina, hollowed out its flesh, leaving only a solid shell, then stuffed it with mashed mutton and fish, followed by sea salt and several types of spices, and repeatedly roasted it over the fire. The meat was fresh, fragrant, and perfectly blended with the sweet and slightly sour flavor of the fruit. Closing the door behind him, Klein first wrote a letter thanking Mr. Azik for his earlier guidance, then he asked again how he could have a messenger of his own. After folding the letter, he took out his copper whistle and summoned the messenger. The messenger didn't stay, disintegrating the moment it took the letter. Klein rested for a moment, ready to enter the space above the gray fog to see if the prayers of the believers could bring him any useful information, such as who he could actually act as. You're tuning in to the Passion Pages YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.